Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Also, do hit that like button and subscribe. Let's go. I'd never been one for rural living. My husband, Tom, had always dreamed of escaping the city, a break from the noise, the endless concrete, the suffocating crowds. So when the opportunity arose for us to purchase a farmhouse in a small town on the edge of nowhere, I didn't put up much of a fight. The price was right, and for the first time in years, the idea of a quiet life seemed tempting. The house itself had character. Or so Tom said. I wasn't entirely convinced. From the outside, it looked like a relic from the past, with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. The windows, though clean, seemed to peer out at you with too much knowing. The walls whispered of forgotten lives of people who lived here before. The elderly couple who had owned it passed away not long ago. Their belongings remained untouched, just as they left them. In those first few weeks, I spent my time cleaning, organizing, trying to make the place feel like home. But something about the house didn't sit right with me. The floorboards creaked at night, and the air always felt damp, even in the summer heat. The oddest thing, though, was Walter. Walter was the neighbor. I don't think I ever saw him smile. He was an old man with a long beard and disheveled clothes. He lived in a run-down shack next to our property, a house that seemed like it might fall apart at any moment. He was always outside, muttering to himself, staring at the woods. At first, I thought he was just lonely. I couldn't blame him. Living in a place like this could drive anyone to madness. One afternoon, I decided to introduce myself. I walked over to his house with a basket of muffins, hoping to break the ice. Walter opened the door slowly, as though he'd been expecting me but hadn't been sure when I'd show up. His eyes were unsettlingly sharp, his gaze cold as he took the basket from me. "Thank you, but you shouldn't have come," he said, his voice hoarse, like it hadn't been used in years. "Not out here. Not in these woods." I laughed it off, assuming it was just the ramblings of an eccentric old man. But there was something about the way he said it that stuck with me. I hadn't seen him since that day, but every time I passed his house, I could feel his eyes on me, watching me from behind the curtains. It was unsettling, and it was only the beginning. It didn't take long for the house to start feeling off. Little things at first. The lights flickering in the middle of the night. I'd wake up, groggy and confused, only to find the kitchen light casting long shadows on the floor. Tom would say it was just the old wiring, but I knew better. I'd unplug everything at night just to be safe. But it didn't stop the strange occurrences. Then there were the sounds. Low, muffled thumps that seemed to come from the basement, where old furniture and boxes were stacked, waiting to be sorted. I'd stand at the top of the stairs, listening to the soft rattle of chains or the dragging of something heavy. Sometimes I'd hear whispers, quiet murmurs that I couldn't make out. I would call down to Tom, but he'd be fast asleep, as oblivious as ever. The worst was the footsteps. They weren't mine. They weren't Tom's. At night, when the house was still, I could hear them walking around outside my window. Slow, deliberate steps crunching the dry earth. I'd pull back the curtains, heart racing, but there would be nothing there. No one. Just the dark, endless stretch of our property. The footsteps always stopped just when I thought I might see who was out there. And then, one evening, as I sat in the living room reading, I noticed something strange outside. A set of footprints leading from the edge of the woods and stopping right at our back door. The prints were large, too large for a man, and the ground was dry. They hadn't been there when I first came outside that morning. I went to the door and opened it cautiously, but there was no one around. I stepped out onto the porch, my heart pounding, and scanned the yard. The footprints led into the woods, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. I hesitated but followed them, my curiosity outweighing my caution. I wandered deeper into the woods, following the trail until I reached the tree line where the footprints stopped. It was there that I saw it. The shack. I hadn't known it was there before, but now it stood like a dark sentinel, hidden away in the trees. It looked abandoned, run down. But something about it felt wrong. I was just about to step closer when I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. I whipped around and found Walter standing in the clearing, his gaze cold and piercing. "I told you not to come out here," he said, his voice tight with warning. "There are things you don't understand." I stood frozen, my feet rooted to the ground. Walter's eyes were intense, but there was a strange desperation behind them, something I hadn't noticed before. "You shouldn't have come," he repeated, his voice low, almost pleading. I didn't know whether he was afraid for me or afraid of what I might find. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaky, but loud enough for him to hear. "What's in that shack, Walter? What's going on here?" I had to know, had to understand what was happening on our property, what was going on with those footprints, and the noises that kept me up at night. Walter's expression shifted from fear to something darker, something harder. He stepped toward me, his old boots crunching on the dry ground. "Stay away from there," he said, his voice trembling with what could have been anger or panic. "You don't know what you're dealing with. People go into those woods and they don't come back. That shack, it's not what you think." I took a step back, unsure whether to take him seriously or dismiss him as just another eccentric old man. But then I noticed the tremor in his hands, the way his eyes kept darting to the trees, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. "I'm not leaving until you tell me what's really going on," I said, my voice firmer now. I had been terrified, yes, but this had gone on long enough. Whatever this was, I was going to get to the bottom of it. Walter stared at me for a long moment, then glanced toward the shack, his face softening. "I'm trying to protect you," he murmured, almost to himself. "I should have never let you move in here. I thought it was safe, thought it had been long enough." My head was spinning. "Safe? What do you mean? What's in there? What happened to the old couple?" Walter's gaze flickered to the ground. "They were the last ones," he said, almost as if speaking to himself. "The last ones to ever go into the shack and come out again." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "What do you mean? What happened to them?" He looked back at me, his face tight with fear. "It's a place for things to hide, and there's no getting out once you've been marked. If you know what's good for you, you'll leave this place, and you'll leave it behind." Before I could respond, Walter turned and started walking back toward his house, muttering something under his breath. I stood there for a moment, the weight of his words settling heavily in my chest. It didn't make sense, but somehow I knew it was all connected. The strange sounds, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. Something was wrong in these woods, and I wasn't going to let it go until I uncovered the truth. It had been days since my conversation with Walter, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking in the woods behind our property. Despite his warning, I couldn't bring myself to drop the matter. Walter had been more cryptic than I'd ever expected. There was something he wasn't telling me. Something about that shack, about the old couple, and about the house itself. The unsettling thought that Walter might be involved in something much darker began to take root. I had to know more, so after much hesitation, I decided to sneak into the woods that evening. I didn't tell Mark. He wouldn't have agreed, and frankly, I didn't trust him to understand. I had to do this on my own. By the time the sun began to set, I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the tree line, my footsteps careful on the dry earth. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the woods stretched on in front of me like a labyrinth of shadows. I could hear distant rustlings, the kind you'd expect from animals moving around, but there was something off about it. Too rhythmic, too deliberate. When I reached the shack, I was startled to find the door slightly ajar, the faintest creak coming from within. It was too quiet for comfort. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to forget about it. But the same curiosity that had driven me here refused to let me walk away. Slowly, I pushed the door open, and the musty, damp air hit me in a rush. The shack was small, barely big enough to fit more than a few people, but there was something about its cramped, cluttered interior that felt suffocating. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, old furniture half buried under dust, and the dim light from my flashlight revealed strange stains on the floor. Deep, dark marks that looked far too much like dried blood. I moved forward cautiously, scanning every corner of the shack. The cries Walter had mentioned echoed in my mind. Were they real? Could they have been from someone trapped in here? I bent down to inspect one of the stains more closely when I noticed something even more disturbing. Beneath the floorboards there was a narrow crack, a gap wide enough for something to slip through or for someone to hide. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt down, pulling at the edges of the floorboards. The boards creaked loudly, and I quickly stopped, afraid of alerting anyone. If anyone else was even out here, I pulled harder, and after a few moments, I managed to pry up the corner. My flashlight flickered over something buried beneath. Bones. human bones. I stumbled back, gasping. My breath came in ragged bursts as I stared at the grim discovery. This wasn't just some abandoned shack. It was a burial ground. A place where bodies had been hidden, covered up, and forgotten. And if Walter was right, if this was a place where people came and never left, then I was standing on the edge of something far more horrifying than I had ever imagined. I needed to leave. I needed to get Mark. But as I turned toward the door, something stopped me. The air shifted, and I felt a presence behind me. A cold, overwhelming weight that pressed on my chest. I wasn't alone. I heard a low creak, the unmistakable sound of a floorboard shifting. Then came a voice. Soft, raspy, and filled with pain. You shouldn't have come. I spun around, my heart racing. But the shack was empty. I froze in place, the blood in my veins turning to ice. The voice had come from nowhere. Empty air, and yet the words echoed in my ears, vibrating deep in my chest. I had to remind myself to breathe, to move. But my feet wouldn't obey, my mind consumed by the weight of what I had just uncovered. Those bones, human bones, beneath the floorboards. How many people had Walter lured out here, only to bury them beneath the very floor where I was standing? With a sharp intake of breath, I tore myself away from the shack, running back to the house, every step heavy, my body trembling. It wasn't until I was safely inside, the door locked behind me, that I dared to let out a shaky breath. I couldn't be certain of everything yet, but I was certain of one thing. Walter knew more about the history of this place than he was letting on. He was hiding something. I found Mark in the living room, his brow furrowed in concern as he saw my frantic state. Emily, what happened? Where did you go? He was standing now, moving toward me with hesitation, but I didn't know how to explain what I had just experienced. What I had seen. It felt too unreal to even say out loud. I went to the shack, Mark, I started, my voice low and shaky. And there's something there. Bodies. They're buried under the floor. Human bones. His eyes widened, but then he shook his head as if trying to dismiss the thought. That's impossible. You must have been mistaken. You've been spending too much time thinking about Walter. No, Mark, I raised my voice, the desperation creeping into my tone. I saw them. There were bones under the floorboards, fresh ones. Someone's been hiding bodies in that shack. Mark didn't argue this time. He stared at me, his face pale, as if a piece of the puzzle was slowly clicking into place. You think Walter did it? His voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know yet, I replied. But I'm sure he's involved. The way he's been acting. The way he tried to warn me off. He knows something, Mark. We need to find out what. At that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced at the front door, a new tension thickening the air. The house felt different now. The walls, the windows, the very ground beneath my feet. They all felt like they were closing in, pressing on me, suffocating me. There was something watching from the shadows, something that I couldn't explain. You need to be careful, Emily, Mark said, his voice tight with concern. Walter's dangerous, and whatever he's hiding, it's worse than we know. I nodded slowly. But there was no turning back now. My curiosity had already led me down this path, and I wasn't going to stop until I had the full truth. If I was right, if Walter was the one behind the disappearances, I had to expose him. And that meant confronting him. I didn't sleep that night. The air was thick with uncertainty, every creak and groan of the house setting my nerves on edge. I sat in the kitchen, my hands shaking as I stared at the clock, watching the hours slip away. Mark had gone to bed, but I couldn't bring myself to rest. Not when everything was about to change. I had to confront Walter once and for all. He was hiding something that could cost us everything. When dawn finally broke, the first light creeping through the blinds, I knew it was time. Mark was still asleep when I grabbed my coat, preparing to head out. There was no time to waste. If Walter was involved in the deaths of those people, I couldn't let him get away with it. He had to face justice, and I was going to make sure of that. I slipped out of the house, the chill morning air biting at my skin. The world around me was eerily quiet, like the calm before a storm. I made my way toward the woods, my footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of fallen leaves. The shack was still there, hidden among the trees like a secret waiting to be uncovered. When I reached the clearing, I saw him. Walter was standing outside, staring at the shack as if waiting for me. His posture was stiff, rigid, and his eyes, those unsettling eyes, met mine with a knowing look. He didn't need to speak for me to know that he had been expecting this moment. "I told you to stay away." Walter's voice was low, dangerous, a hint of a threat lacing every word. "You should have listened to me, Emily." I swallowed hard, but I didn't back down. "You're not going to get away with this, Walter. I know what you've been doing. I know about the bodies. It's over." Walter's lips curled into a twisted smile, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just waltz in here and expose me? You have no idea what you're up against. People like me, we don't get caught." I could feel the weight of his words sinking in, but there was no turning back now. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, trying to steady my voice. "This ends today." Without another word, Walter stepped toward me, his movements smooth and calculated. He reached for something hidden under his coat, and my heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what it was, whether it was a weapon, a tool, or something else entirely. But the intent behind his actions was unmistakable. In an instant, everything changed. Walter lunged, and I barely had time to react. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, as he closed the distance between us. But before he could reach me, a loud crack echoed through the clearing. Mark had followed me. I turned just in time to see him raise the shotgun, the barrel pointed directly at Walter. "Get away from her," Mark shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos. Walter froze, his face twisted in fury, but the hesitation in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. "You're making a mistake," Walter hissed, his teeth gritted. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Mark replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. "And I'm not going to let you hurt anyone else." For a moment, everything was still. Walter seemed to consider his options, his eyes flicking between me and Mark. Then, with a growl, he turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. "We need to follow him," I said, my voice urgent. But Mark shook his head. "No, this isn't over, Emily, but we need to do this the right way." I nodded, my heart still pounding in my chest. Walter might have escaped for now, but I knew he wouldn't get far. The truth was out, and we were going to make sure he paid for what he'd done. As we made our way back to the house, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. It wasn't over yet, but at least we had the upper hand. Walter couldn't hide from the truth forever, and neither could the secrets of this town. The next few days were a blur. The authorities had been notified, and the investigation into Walter's hideaway had begun. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Walter was still out there, lurking in the shadows, and I knew in my gut that he wouldn't stop until he had done everything in his power to erase the truth. We couldn't wait for the law to catch up with him. Mark and I had made a decision. We were going after Walter, together. I had never been one for violence, but this was different. This wasn't just about self-defense or protecting our home. This was about stopping a monster before he could kill again. Walter had already taken too much from this town, from those people who had disappeared into the woods without a trace. And now it was our turn to make sure he never took another life. The sun was setting when we finally set out, our plan in place. We didn't go quietly, we made sure Walter knew we were coming. Armed and ready, we trekked through the woods, the same path I had walked countless times before, but now it felt different. The air was heavy with anticipation, the trees whispering in the wind as if urging us onward. It wasn't long before we found him. Walter was waiting for us, standing in the clearing by the shack. His eyes gleamed with malice, but there was no hint of fear. He had nothing left to lose. He knew this confrontation was inevitable. "You really think you can stop me?" Walter sneered, his voice thick with venom. "You're just two people against everything I've built. You're too weak." Mark stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Walter's. "You're the weak one, hiding behind your lies, your traps, and your lies. You're nothing more than a coward." I could see the rage building in Walter's eyes, the facade of control slipping. With a wild roar, he lunged at us. It was all we could do to stay ahead of him as he rushed forward with a terrifying speed. Mark raised his shotgun, but Walter knocked it from his hands with a single swipe. I didn't hesitate. I had prepared for this. I dove behind the shack for cover as Walter circled us, his every movement calculated, a predator sizing up his prey. The man who had once been a simple neighbor had become something unrecognizable, consumed by his need for power and control. He was dangerous, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and it was time for him to face the consequences. Mark recovered quickly, pulling out a knife he'd concealed in his jacket. Together, we charged. I managed to get close enough to land a blow, my fist connecting with Walter's jaw, sending him stumbling back. For a split second, I saw a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, the realization that he wasn't as invincible as he thought. "You're finished," I growled, but before I could take another step, Walter lunged at me. He was faster than I expected, his hands gripping my throat as he slammed me into the ground. The world spun as I fought for air, but I didn't give up. I kicked, I scratched, I fought with everything I had. The desperation to survive, to end this, coursed through my veins. Mark was there. He tackled Walter off me, the two men crashing into the dirt in a flurry of fists and blood. My heart raced as I scrambled to my feet, barely registering the sharp pain in my side. I knew it would take more than brute force to bring Walter down. There, in the middle of that fight, I saw the glint of a rusty axe left abandoned on the ground. Without thinking, I grabbed it. I didn't hesitate. As Walter got the upper hand on Mark, I swung the axe with all my strength, the steel biting deep into his side. Walter howled in pain, but he didn't stop. He kept coming, relentless in his rage. But this time, Mark was ready. With a swift motion, he disarmed him, knocking the knife from his hand and finally gaining control. Together, we forced Walter to the ground. He struggled, but it was over. The law would be here soon, but Walter had lost. His twisted reign had ended. I stood over him, panting, my body sore and battered from the fight. Walter was unconscious, his body limp beneath me, but the fear that had once consumed me was gone. It was over. We had won. And though the sheriff arrived soon after, taking Walter into custody, I knew that this town, our town, would never be the same. The darkness that had loomed over it for so long had been pushed back. The truth had been exposed. As we left the woods that night, walking hand in hand with the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The burden of fear had lifted, and with it, a new chapter began. This town had its scars, but it would heal. And for the first time in a long while, we could breathe again. I think my new neighbors are running a trap house across the street, and that's not even the worst part. My wife Gloria and I recently moved to a small town in the mountains after living in the city for over a decade. I was the typical trophy house husband and father, complete with a dad bod and exquisite sense of humor. She had been a dutiful police officer for 9 years until the accident. All those years I worried about her safety. Every morning I woke up hoping that she'd come home, knowing of the dangers she faced on the streets just by doing her job. The patrolling, the confrontations, the uncertainty. A bad thought or scenario would surface and I'd have to push it back down. If I hadn't heard from her because she was on the clock, forget it, I was a mess. I couldn't stand to face it. I had to be optimistic and upbeat for our daughter. I'd settle back into our routines and the whole world would go round once again. You go on like this mechanically. Every mile is promised when the ride is smooth. You're lulled into comfort, unaware that the engine or tire could blow out at any second. Then one day you get the call you've been dreading. Just, it was her day off. She was bringing our daughter home from dance class. All those years. All of that love and trust and hope was taken away by a drunk driver at 3:39 p.m. on a Sunday. Gloria survived barely, but our daughter didn't. I wish the asshole who killed her survived so I could murder him myself. Alas, the world is a messed up place with little justice. The rehab was intense, but we got through it. Gloria was able to regain her strength, and after months of therapy, she walked again. It was the third best moment of my life, right behind the birth of our daughter and our wedding. The elation dropped as soon as I was reminded of our past amidst the current reality. Even the triumphs were rooted in tragedy. You might as well have killed both of us because now our purpose to live was dead. We both sunk into a pretty deep depression. Anger surfaced, then contempt and bitterness. We came to a head where neither of us were happy anymore. We both decided it would be best to get a fresh start and try to live again. We could create our own second chance. So we packed up a couple of suitcases and took off in the middle of the night, looking for our new home. It was a hell of a road trip. We drove all over the state looking for the right place, and we finally found it after 543 miles of roaming. A little town named Hunter took our hearts away. It was one of those rustic old destinations where people said hello to you when they passed you on the street. They even waved while driving by, even if they didn't know you. Being from the city, it was a little unsettling at first. The smiles and pleasant nature of people was suspicious. We were naturally untrusting, so it took a while to get used to. We were planning on renting a small place while we looked for a home to anchor. But on that same fateful trip, we passed by a small house on the edge of town with a for sale sign hanging on the lawn. It was a perfect two-story cottage at the end of a cul-de-sac. We called the number and the mousy guy on the other end answered on the first ring, as if he were sitting by the phone waiting for us to call. A pudgy middle-aged man showed up not 15 minutes later with screeching tires. Everything about him was loose. His clothes, his movements. He hurriedly hopped out of the car and fumbled with the keys. He passed us with a simple nod and a hum, then fiddled with the lock. His eyes were crossed, and he had a gentle nature. He spoke with a tremendous stutter accompanied by a twitch of the eyes. Maybe he had Tourette's. Either way, I liked the guy. In hindsight, I think he knew what we were getting into. That's why he was so willing to get rid of the place. After inspecting the spot, we convened in the spare bedroom. I watched Gloria as she looked underneath the window where a crib could be. The sun cast a ray on my imagination. She turned to me and nodded. We made an offer right then and there. It was a very generous price tag. We felt like we got away with a steal. I'm sure the seller laughed about it as he drove away. It wasn't until we were hustling boxes off a U-Haul when we saw our neighbors for the first time. You heard them before you saw them. Like thunder rumbling on the horizon, they were cussing up a storm, barking at each other like dogs. One look at them and a single word came to mind: trashy. The woman was short and oval like Penguin in Batman Forever. Her roots were muddy and her tips were an orangish yellow from too many dollar store dye jobs. She walked with a hobble and a fake diamond twinkled above her upper lip. The guy looked kinda like Mohawk, the gremlin complete with his own faux hawk. Scrawny but hardened by a lifetime of endless shit, surely. It was only right that he always wore a wife beater. They passed by with tall boy Coors Light cans dangling from their fingertips and cigarettes hanging from their lips. The fat one spit at Gloria. "What you lookin' at, bitch?" Gloria gasped. Maybe they're just passing by. They crossed the street and my heart sunk. They were on their way to the house directly across from us. The one with the overgrown weeds in the lawn and bed-sheet curtains. 227. Great. This was going to be just great. "Shut up," Foxhawk said. "The bitch is staring at me," the egg whined. "Give me the keys." "F you," her bark echoed. "This is my house. I ain't giving you shit, you junkie bitch." "F you," he croaked. "No F you," she bellowed. "You're lucky I don't." Their voices quieted slightly when they entered the house and the door shut behind them. But their quarrel boomed out of the window. Their apartment acted like empty chambers that inadvertently created loudspeakers for their mutual abuse. "Kick your ass out. Better yet, let me call the cops on your ass right now." "I'll kill you." "Try it. I'll call the cops and send your junkie ass back to jail." "You want to die today?" I looked over to Gloria, and she instinctively reached for her hip. I shook my head no. She realized what she was doing and pulled her hand away like she had touched a burning briquette. I felt it then, a tightness somewhere deep inside me. It squeezed my soul. Something was going to happen. Someone was going to say the wrong thing at some point, and some shit was going to go down. "Hey yo." I startled and swung around to the source of the sound. Striding across our lawn was a goofy-looking white man with khaki shorts that hung well above his pale knees. His bald, sweaty head glistened, and the sun reflected off his thick glasses. He extended his hand. "You must be the new neighbors." I shook his wet noodle, and his smile comforted me a little after our introduction to the couple across the street. If you were to judge him by his smile, he'd be a fond friend. "I'm Brian," I said. "This is my wife." "Gloria," she said, shaking his hand. "It's nice to meet you." "Pleasure is all mine. The name's Charlie Sullivan. I live right next door. If you need anything, and I mean anything, please don't be afraid to ask." "Say," I lowered my voice, "what's up with them?" I nudged my head to the house across the street. Their shouts were still amplified to the neighborhood. "Oh," his smile dropped to a frown. "They're the worst." "Do we have to worry about them?" Gloria asked. "I wouldn't go leaving the doors unlocked at night," he said with a nervous chuckle. "If I were you." Are they dangerous? I asked. There was an awkward silence, and he just stared at me. His unsettling smile was unwavering. I extended my hand again. Well, it was nice to meet you, but we gotta get this truck back before 5. He looked down at my hand and took a step back. Yes, that would be a good idea. He turned and went rushed inside. The house sat motionless through time like it had been abandoned long ago. Something told me that he was watching us from the shadows of those large open windows. We finished unloading the truck and then returned it to the U-Haul depot. When we got back, the house across the street was blaring music. Gloria was clearly bothered by this. I figured that it was still a decent hour. They had every right to play music in their own house. I carried Gloria across the threshold of our new home and gingerly put her down in the middle of our new living room. We were surrounded by meticulously labeled boxes. I leaned in for a passionate kiss. She pecked me and limped over to a stack of boxes. She'd check a box, lift it, cut open the next one, shuffle around inside, then repeat. We can unpack tomorrow, I said soothingly. How about we christen the place first? My Isaac Hayes impression did nothing to dissuade her. Her search became more frantic. What are you looking for? Her elbows were pumping as she sifted through a box. Then she abruptly stopped, and the tenseness in her shoulders slackened with relief. What could be so important? She lifted something carefully out of the box and turned around. Her Glock 17. What are you doing with that? She limped by me and hobbled over to the dining room window. She pulled the blinds down and looked out at the house across the street. Gloria, what are you doing? I don't trust them. Neither do I, but I highly doubt we have to worry about it. She looked at me, completely bewildered, like didn't recognize me. I calmly walked over and placed one hand on her hip, the other on the gun. As I pulled her in for a hug, I slipped the gun out of her grasp. She rested her cheek on my chest, and the sweet lavender scent of her hair closed my eyes with ease. We rocked back and forth. Home again. The slow dance became a grinding of our hips. I tightened my grip on her waist and placed the gun on a box in order to slide my other hand underneath her hair and around the back of her neck. We crashed to the floor, me as her mat cushioning the blow, and we made love for the first time in our new home on our dining room floor. I'll be sure to remember that when we have guests over for Thanksgiving. We unpacked a speaker and played the Dead Tongues from our phone while we drank wine and ate pizza on the floor. It was great. We were laughing and carrying on like we had when we first moved in together, back when we were rambling 20-somethings searching for meaning in the city's art scene. It felt like we made the right decision coming all the way out here. We dropped the mattress on the floor and settled in for the night. I was dead tired but couldn't sleep. The music from across the street was loud enough to wake the dead. The bass kicks were lined with an organ. The cocking of a gun. Bang, bang. I'll probably be punished for hard living, blind to the facts. Cars kept pulling up and groups of people got out and piled into the house. Every time the door opened, shouts and commotion would rise with the music. Thugs as convicts in God's prison, hands on the strap. It was some party going on over there. You'd think they'd invite their new neighbors. Praying, so Father, please forgive me. Police be rushing when they see me. I rolled over to throw my arm around Gloria, but my hand landed on an empty mattress. I flaunted, America's Most Wanted, live on TV. I sat up in bed and looked over to the window. Gloria was watching the cars come and go from the corner of the curtains. Life, pleasure, and pain, stuck in this game, holler my name, Gloria. She didn't hear me. She was too busy watching the people being shuttled in. Some were tweaking, others were having withdrawals. All of them hurried inside as soon as the cars pulled up. They desperately wanted whatever was in there. We all gone die, we bleed through similar veins. I got out of bed and hugged Gloria from behind. She sighed. Come on, I whispered tiredly in her ear. Let's get back to bed. She was biting her nails again. I thought she had ditched that nasty habit. I dragged her back to bed and she lied there, facing away from me so she could keep watch of the window. I big spooned her and caressed her hair until I fell asleep. My dreams were laced with the beats of our neighbor's music, a restless and sweaty sleep. I entered the house across the street, and the place was dark and quiet until an electrical saw cut through the silence. Wake up. It was coming from the other room, the only light in the place. I tiptoed closer and stuck an eye out from around the corner. Wake up. A beastly man with long ratty hair dangling below his shoulders was hunched over a stainless steel table. Wake up. The saw was cranking through grisly bone. Blood spun out, caking the ceiling and walls with chunky crimson. Wake up. The man was naked underneath a plastic see-through apron and welding helmet. Wake up. Blood pooled around his ragged bare feet. Wake up. The visitors were lined up down the hallway. Livestock to be slaughtered and sold. Glass shattered behind me, and I spun around. The shards clattered off the tile floor. Wake up. I leapt out of my dream with a rush of fear, my breath unable to escape my seized chest. I sat up, staring at Gloria. She shook me frantically. There's someone in the house, she growled. What? There's someone in the... Downstairs, a chair scraped against the hardwood floor like someone was sitting down at our table. I heard a light chatter, but couldn't make out what they were saying. Two distinct voices. A young girl, no older than 4, and an old man. I leapt out of bed naked, ready for combat. Gloria was right behind me, retrieving her gun from the box beside the bed. I marched down the stairs and hurried into the kitchen, flipping on the lights. I rounded the corner like a Celtic warrior on a battlefield, roaring naked. I ran into an empty room. A lone chair was pulled out from under the table with enough room to fit a body. But there was nobody there. The glass pane on the kitchen door was broken, and the glass was littered about the floor. Feet clucked against the hardwood above us. We were under the spare bedroom. We looked at each other. The baby. I know we both thought it. I don't know why. Our baby was dead. Gloria rushed upstairs anyways. Annabelle? Baby, I cried. Be careful with your leg. She didn't listen, and hobbled up the stairs with her gun still pointed at the threat points. I raced after her. We slowed on the landing. A thud came from the spare bedroom. SHHH, they're coming. Gloria rounded the corner with her gun drawn, and I flipped on the light. She stepped into the center of the room and turned to me, completely flabbergasted. I stood in the doorway out of breath. I leaned against the door frame. There was someone in here, she said. I heard Whom? Her chest caved in from a violent shove of air, and she tripped over a stack of boxes, slamming into the wall. I felt a punch to my gut and was thrown to the ground. I felt an invisible hand grip my ankle and pull me down the hallway. Gloria cried out as the door to the spare room slammed shut. I skidded across the carpet and was let go. My skin burned from the friction. I scrambled to my feet and rushed to the spare room door. Gloria. It was locked from inside. I dropped my shoulder into it before the door frame finally splintered and gave in. I collapsed to the floor beside her. She bellowed in pain. I took her straight to the emergency room. The party across the street was still raging when we left. Gloria's tibia was rebroken. They had to reset it, cast it, and she was ordered bed rest for 2 straight weeks. We rented a wheelchair, got some pain pills, and they kicked us out. The sky was a pale cobalt by the time we got home. I parked in the driveway and helped Gloria with her crutches. The morning birds were chirping, and a calmness had finally settled over our small neighborhood. I could get used to this. Too bad it never lasted long before the trolls activated again. The moment our heads hit the pillows, the bass began again. Gloria screamed, her rage straining her throat. You're going to have to talk to them. Now. She only had to look at me, and I knew the answer to that. I reluctantly crawled out of bed and stumbled back into my clothes. So unfair. Gloria was groaning in pain when I left her. I stumbled across the street and strode up to the door, which shook from the speakers inside. I dropped the butt of my fist onto the wood with a little force to let them know I'm serious and waited. Nothing. I knocked again. This time harder. The music only got louder. I banged. Music went up. I booted the door repeatedly until the music cut off. What do you think you're doing? I turned around and the crackhead foxhawk guy boxed me onto the porch, fidgeting and surging with readiness. He kept a hand hidden behind his back. I'd have to dive off the porch to have a chance at getting away. Are you seriously kicking on my door right now? Listen, it's been a really long night. You don't gotta take it out on my door. The music. The door creaked open behind me, and I heard the familiar pump of a shotgun. The egg croaked. What are you doing kicking on my door at 5:46 in the morning? I turned to the Mossberg and shuddered. I scurried to the edge of the porch, but the crackhead cut me off and took a step up the stairs. He extended his hand out from behind his back to reveal a kitchen knife. Okay, let's all just... Shut up, she barked. I gulped. She raised the shotgun to my head. Let me tell you what's going to happen. You're never gonna bother us again. Yeah, hear me. You're blasting music at all times of night. Bitch, don't tell me what I can or cannot do on my property. This is America, you piece of shit. We got a lil thing called freedom here. There's gotta be a county or city sound ordinance. People are trying to sleep. If you keep blasting your music, I'll call the call. Hops. I felt the tip of the knife jab me lightly in the kidney. The crackhead hooked my neck with his elbow and choked me out. I could hear his labored breath hissing through the gaps of his missing teeth. You know how much a kidney costs on the black market? The crackhead said. He tightened his grip until I dropped to my knees, completely lightheaded and ready to pass out. He loosened up enough for me to breathe, but wouldn't release me. The pig approached, crouched down, and dropped the barrel to my balls. If you ever call the cops on me, I'll murder you, your wife, and anyone you ever loved. You understand me? Are we on the same page? I garbled from beneath the grip of the crackhead's elbow. I said, do you understand me? Why? He twisted the tip of the knife, and I felt a rivulet of blood crawl down my side and soak into my shorts. Yes, yes. Good, she said. Stay on your side of the street, or I'll bury you like a dog. I was released and nearly fell, but luckily was able to stay up. He kicked me as he passed, and they both went inside. I caught a glimpse of inside before the door slammed shut. The place was empty. No furniture, no garbage or appliances. There was nothing inside. I got up and dejectedly crossed the street. I wiped a tear from my eye and sniffled as I looked up to our bedroom window. The curtain fell back to its resting place. She was watching. She saw everything. When I got to bed, she had her leg raised up on pillows, but her face was turned away from me. The moonlight shined off her cheeks. She had been crying. The next day I stepped out to get some supplies for Gloria. I figured that chocolate might cheer her up. Chocolate makes everything better, she always says. I had to try something in order to make up for the night prior. My mind kept running, making up different ways it could have gone down, none of which involved me being punked out like that. I thought about killing them, and then my mind ran away with it, and soon I envisioned myself standing trial and serving time for murder. My prison nickname became Sauce Boss because of my culinary clout. When I got back, I saw Charlie mowing his front lawn. He was wearing an American flag Speedo and glasses. That's it. It was truly a sight to behold. I waved and started to walk over to him. When he spotted me, he abruptly shut down the lawn mower and hurried into his house. I stopped on the property line. That's weird. As I walked back, I felt like I was being watched. I looked over to Charlie's window and caught him standing there staring at me expressionless. Inside, the house seemed empty. I called out for Gloria and got no response. I went up to the guest bedroom and found her there, hunched over the desk. A camera was set up in the window, and the binoculars sat on its fat end. I knew what that meant. A stakeout. Hun, I said, stepping inside her bullpen. She had already set up the printer. Lists and photos were pinned to a cork board that rested against the wall. Hoon, she grunted as she lifted the binoculars and watched the house across the street. What are you doing? A little research. On our new neighbors. Baby, I don't think we should go Provo. Just listen, she finished writing a note and dropped the pen. She handed me 8x10 printouts of their mugshots. Nate Calhoun and Tasha Mariotti. Both have lengthy records. Nate just got out after serving 6 months for aggravated battery, resisting arrest, and unlawful entry. He was able to avoid the attempted second-degree murder charge because he struck up a plea deal. He helped take down his main competitors by snitching on them, allowing his girlfriend, the lovely Tasha, to take over the market with their supply on his behalf. They are far from kingpins, but have done enough damage. We're not talking about weed here. We're talking about the bad stuff. Mainly pills and heroin. They are suspected of flooding the market with that fentanyl-laced shit. Really dangerous stuff. Overdoses have skyrocketed since Nate was released from prison. I cleared my throat. You've learned all of this in the time it took me to go to the grocery store. I mean, she shrugged, the internet. Don't you think this is taking things a little too far? I asked. Too far? Too far? They held you at gunpoint last night. You were stabbed for Christ's sake. I should call the... No, don't. She shook her head in disappointment. She grabbed her crutches and struggled to get up on one leg. Let's not escalate things, please. Why are you so afraid? Oh, I don't know. Maybe because they held me at gunpoint and stabbed me. They're loose cannons. I don't trust them. So we get rid of them. I couldn't believe what she was saying. I was disgusted by it. Yet I found myself nodding. She was right. Did you see anything last night? Did you see inside? They have no furniture. I saw nothing. Did you see anyone? Unless they were in a different room or the basement, no. There was no one. HMPH, that's weird. What's weird? I've been watching them all day. More and more people come, but I haven't seen anyone leave. Are you sure? Positive. They just keep coming too. There's no way that house can hold that many people. They go in, but they don't come out. So, where do they go? I don't know. Around sunset, we sat out on the front porch, and I admired how the sun basked the earth with golden delight. Gloria was watching the house across the street from the corner of her eyes. She made it seem that she was facing the opposite direction, but I knew the art of detective work at play here. Her leg was propped up on a pillow that lined another chair. This was why we moved here. The perfect, serene. You're a whore. Nate's voice rolled over the hill. Go F yourself, Tasha spat as she hobbled down the street. You loser. Of course, nothing great lasts. Our peace was shattered by these assholes. They noticed us on the porch and the mongrel stuck up a middle finger. I lowered my gaze and Gloria glared at them with contempt. F, you slut, Tasha crooned in our direction. Keep starring. They lingered at their front door for a minute before finally entering their house. The world returned to sanity for a moment before a window opened and their argument polluted the street. Say it one more time, bitch, Tasha shouted. One more time, see what happens. I'll mess you up, bro. I don't give a F. Why you mad? Huh? Why you mad? You ain't shit. Oh yeah, you like that filet mignon though, didn't you, bitch? Huh? I got you that filet mignon and your fat trap was shut for once. Huh? Hoohin? Ain't that right, bitch? F. You. Gloria got up and angrily crutched her way inside. I can't listen to this shit. I finished my whiskey and realized I had enough of it too. I got up and saw Charlie pull into his driveway. He put the car in park and shut off his engine. He placed his hand on the door handle and looked over to me. Concern spread across his face. He shook his head in disapproval, then started his car again. He backed out and drove off with screeching tires. What a weirdo. As I opened the door, I heard a terrible crash from across the street. Then screams. The shouting erupted and more things shattered. It sounded like the place was being torn apart. I don't see what they could have been throwing. There was nothing inside. I found Gloria at her desk upstairs. How she got up so fast is besides me. I think we should call the cops, I said. Really, why? I think he's going to kill her. Good. Let him. What? She'd be dead. He'd be in jail. The world would be a better place. The callousness in her voice sent a chill through my veins. This wasn't the empathic police officer I'd known for the past 13 years. I was at a loss for words, so I left her there with her new obsession. At least she was focused on something other than her grief. That night, the music was louder than the night before. It was like they added another sound system to the ruckus. Yelling and screaming was masked by the music. There were times where I thought I heard genuine pain. I was finally nodding off when Gloria threw the blankets off me. What? What is it? I can't sleep. I can't do this. I have to call the cops. You can't. They're crazy. Yeah, well, they're driving me crazy too. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand and dialed 911. Hello? I'd like to make a noise complaint. We lied in bed until red and blue lights filled our room. For a brief moment, I couldn't move. My chest tightened and despite my best effort, couldn't move my hands. Then I broke free from my trance when Gloria pulled me from bed. We went over to the window and watched as the cop walked up to the house and spoke with Nate and Tasha on the porch. He finished up, shook Nate's hand, and started walking toward our house. When we opened the door, the officer was already knocking with agitation. Good evening, the officer said. You're the ones who called the police. Yes, sir, my wife said. Thank you for coming. We take prank calls really seriously around here. You should only call 911 for emergencies, the officer said with a monotone voice. Calls like this are a waste of taxpayer money. No, my wife said with a huff. We pay taxes for you to do your job.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you yuppies go back to wherever the hell you came from? What's that supposed to mean? Exactly what it sounds like. We do things differently around here. What, you hold someone at gunpoint and make threats? The officer smiled. Noted. Thank you, officer. I'm sorry for the false alarm. I promise to never bother you again. My wife slammed the door in the officer's face and locked the door. I've seen that look on her face before. She was about to do something brave, stupid, but extremely brave. I hated her for it, but also knew that I couldn't stop her. I had to try. There was no telling what she might do. Years of pent-up rage could flare up in a split-second decision. I couldn't allow her the chance. It could be lethal. She kept her gun on her hip all night until we settled into bed. Then it sat on the nightstand close enough to kiss. As we were drifting into the sweetness of undisturbed sleep that can only be achieved by absolute silence, a beat dropped. The music was back, along with the bustle. Gloria sat on the edge of the bed and cried in defeat. I couldn't console her. I had accepted the fact that I was a coward. I couldn't stand up for myself. How could I stand up for her? I don't do anything when given the chance. I'm too afraid. They called her a bitch and a slut, and I said nothing. They threatened my life, and I did nothing. Maybe I was nothing. Strangely, her tears soothed me. I was soon fast asleep. No such luck for her. She thought she might be close to finally crying herself asleep when she heard a little girl's voice flutter up through the window. It was distinctly familiar. Annabelle. No, the little girl cried out. Please don't. Gloria shot into proper posture and watched as a large man with long hair roughly pulled a little girl out of a car and dragged her across the lawn toward the front door. I don't want to go. Stop it. No, please. Gloria had enough. She buckled her holster onto her hip and left the room. I must have heard the front screen door screech open and slap shut because I woke up in a rush of adrenaline. I noticed that Gloria was gone immediately. Gloria. I listened and the house groaned. Clack, clack, clack trickled in through the window. I jumped out of bed and ran over to the window. Gloria was crossing the street on her crutches toward the house that towered ominously over her. The music got louder like my ears were to the speakers, eardrums rattling like broken tweeters. I stumbled into a pair of boxers and grabbed a fire iron on my way out the door. Racing across the street, the music matched my heartbeat. Their door was open and strobe lights flashed from within. Shit. I used to have epileptic fits growing up. This could send me into a seizure. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. I pushed my way through the door and ran into a mass of sweaty bodies. A horde of naked and emaciated humans were squirming and wriggling together like a den of snakes. Their tattoos hung in grotesque fashion from their loose skin. Their body odor was putrid, like they'd been mashing their shit and piss like grapes into summer heat. They were absent of hair and face down. All you could see were the back of their stretching necks and their occipital and parietal bones. The inside of their forearms were rotted with needle marks. Some still had needles in them. I was shoved from behind by a gust of wind and the door slammed shut. I plunged into the bodies like a newborn coming down the canal. They were slimy and I slipped deeper into the mass. I passed by a woman that was hunched over. When I touched her, it seemed to jar her back into awareness. Her eyes lit up, she screamed briefly, and then she sunk back into her stupor. Gloria? It became harder to breathe as the bodies pressed down on me. More screams and shrieks from around the room. I began using the fire iron to push them back, but they collapsed back onto me with more force. I jabbed and prodded my way through the living room and into the hallway. Gloria? I woke them up. Their heads lifted and their attention turned to me. They descended onto me and I swung the iron, connecting with heads and shoulders and necks. They dropped without much of a fight. I could feel them scratching and biting and gouging, but the adrenaline didn't allow me to register pain. I was doing a decent job of plowing through those zombie junkies, but was being overrun. There were too many of them. They piled on top of me. One of them, I could clearly make out, was Nate. His eyes were glassy and dead. Spittle trickled from the corner of his mouth. He removed the needle from his arm. It was still full of fentanyl-laced heroin. The needle descended toward my skin, its sharp point hungry for my blood. My vein throbbed. The tip plunged, his thumb pushed, the heroin dispersed, my pupils dilated. Bang, bang. His smile exploded into a mist of blood and brains. Gloria collected me, but I was unable to move. Those drugs were fast-moving agents of splendor. I sank deeper, further from reality. I saw a dozen hands slip from the darkness with needles and stab my wife. She thrashed as the drugs splashed into her bloodstream. Her fight diminished until she was lying next to me, her back threaded with needles like an acupuncture session. Above us, the room had been cleared with a breeze. We were alone in the white and black space of nothingness, and it felt so good. I never wanted to leave. We woke up in the same position in our bed. Thank God it was a dream, just a normal morning, except for the mosquito bite on the inside of my forearm right above my artery. The wound burned. Besides that, I felt great all morning until I started to get tired. My mood swung sharply into depression, and I was agitated by the light, by the food I was eating, by my wife's presence. Everything. Then came the sweating and the headaches, then the vomiting. I don't know how I knew what would help, I just did. It was instinct, I guess. Gloria was no better off. She made the suggestion. That night, I went across the street and knocked gently on the door. Gloria was beside me. Nate answered, a sinister smile spread across his face. Wasn't he dead? Gloria shot him. Oh wait, I thought, that was but a dream. Was it? It all felt so real. Of course it was a dream. Here he was. We entered the house and removed our clothing, then we took off our wigs. We huddled together in the heat until we were served a dose. Tasha went around administering the drug. She got to me and slid the needle into my vein, pumping me with shit. She just did it and I watched. I let her. Once we got high, everything was fine. The music was bumping. There was nothing to worry about. At first, my neighbors and I didn't get along. I thought they were assholes. After getting to know them, I couldn't imagine how I'd get through life without them. They have what we need. Why bite the hand that feeds you? I'm thankful that they're so close. It just makes life so much easier. I think my neighbors are running a trap house across the street, and the worst part is, I love it. The house sat at the end of a long, winding street, where the trees lined up like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky. Rachel had always dreamed of this. A life away from the chaos, the constant noise, the overwhelming blur of city lights and car horns. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet place to settle down to find peace. So when she found the house, nestled in a cul-de-sac with a tall fence and overgrown yard, she knew it was the one. The agent had called it a diamond in the rough, but Rachel saw it as more than that. It was a sanctuary. At first, everything was perfect. The quiet was the kind she hadn't known in years, the kind that wraps around you like a thick blanket. She spent the days cleaning, unpacking, and getting familiar with the place. The neighbors were friendly enough. Just a wave and a smile when they passed by. But there was always something off. An underlying edge to their greetings. A sense that they were just a little too interested in her life. But it wasn't enough to raise concern. She had been living in the city for so long. She figured it was just the way things were in small towns. People watched each other. It was normal. The first oddity came a week after she moved in. It wasn't anything major. Just a few patches of trampled grass near the fence at the back of her property. Nothing she couldn't explain away. Maybe kids had wandered in, or an animal had crossed the yard. But it happened again, and again. Every few days, the same spot in the grass flattened like something, or someone, had walked through it. And every time, Rachel found herself standing at the window, staring out into the yard, wondering if she was imagining things. There were no footprints, no signs of anything living, just the flattening of the grass, as though the earth itself had been pressed down by an unseen force. The second strange thing came when she started noticing that things in the house weren't where she had left them. A mug on the kitchen counter would be a few inches to the left. The TV remote would be sitting on the coffee table when she was sure she had placed it on the armchair. At first, she thought she was just being forgetful. Maybe she was tired. But as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. She checked the locks on the windows and doors every night before bed. It became a ritual. She would pull each one shut, feeling the click of the lock. But every time, she couldn't help but wonder if someone had been inside while she was asleep. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, she came home to find the back door slightly ajar. A chill ran down her spine as she stepped inside, calling out for anyone who might be there, though she already knew no one would answer. But the sense of intrusion was undeniable. She hadn't left it open. No one else lived here, and yet there it was. An undeniable sign that someone somehow had been inside. She checked everything. Nothing appeared out of place. Nothing was missing. But something in the air felt different, heavier. And that's when she began to wonder if maybe the house wasn't as empty as she thought. Rachel's nerves frayed as the days stretched on. The noises became harder to ignore. Scratching sounds in the walls. Soft taps on the windows in the dead of night. The feeling of being watched. She began to second-guess herself, wondering if she was simply letting her mind get the better of her. She had been alone for too long. Maybe the isolation was playing tricks on her. But every time she turned off the lights and lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. In the early hours of one morning, after lying awake for hours listening to the creaks of the house, Rachel decided to check the security cameras she had installed just in case. She wasn't sure why she had done it. Maybe it was just a precautionary measure, something to make her feel safe. But now she was glad she had. The footage from the previous night was grainy and unclear, but there was something. A figure, tall and pale, standing just outside her window, watching her sleep. Rachel froze. She rewound the footage, watching again. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, its face obscured by the shadow of the night. She felt her heart race as she reached for her phone to call the police, but stopped herself. What could she say? There was no way to explain this. No way to prove that someone was out there watching her. Rachel couldn't shake the image of the figure from the security footage. It gnawed at her every moment. The pale shape, unmoving, just standing there as if it had been waiting for her to notice. She hadn't heard anything that night. No knocking or scratching on the window, no footsteps outside. It was as if the figure hadn't even been there. But the footage didn't lie, and there was no denying it now. Someone had been watching her. She spent the next few days obsessing over the footage, replaying it in her mind every time she closed her eyes. But there was something else that troubled her. The figure didn't seem to react to the camera, didn't even acknowledge its presence. It was like it had no fear of being caught. It wasn't just watching her. It was waiting. The idea sent a cold shiver down her spine, and the creeping paranoia settled in deeper. It was like the house had become a cage, the walls pressing in tighter and tighter with every passing day. The isolation that had once seemed so appealing was now suffocating, oppressive. Rachel tried to reach out to her neighbors, hoping that they might know something, anything that could explain the strange occurrences. But when she knocked on the door of the house next door, the elderly couple who lived there acted as if everything was perfectly normal. Mrs. Delaney, the wife, gave her a warm smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, Rachel, how lovely to see you. No, we haven't seen anything unusual around here. Perhaps you're just getting used to the quiet," she said with a knowing nod. Her husband, Mr. Delaney, didn't even look up from his rocking chair. They both seemed so utterly unbothered by her concerns that Rachel's stomach twisted with unease. "You're probably right," Rachel said, forcing a smile. "Just adjusting, I guess." But the lie felt bitter on her tongue. There was something off about the Delaneys, something that didn't sit right. They seemed too eager to dismiss her, too eager to keep their own secrets. She left their house with an uneasy sense of being watched, but she told herself it was just her imagination running wild. It wasn't uncommon for people to be uncomfortable with the unfamiliar. As the days wore on, Rachel started noticing the subtle shifts in her surroundings. The trampled grass in the backyard became more frequent, as if someone had been pacing back and forth, and the scratching noises on the walls grew louder, more persistent. At night, she would lie in bed, her heart pounding in her chest, listening to the faint scuttling sounds that seemed to come from behind the plaster. She could hear it even over the hum of the air conditioning. Sometimes she thought she heard whispers, low, muffled voices, coming from the walls themselves. It was as if the house had become a living thing, breathing, shifting, whispering secrets she wasn't meant to know. But it wasn't just the house. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. She could feel eyes on her every time she stepped outside, every time she walked down the hallway. No matter where she went, no matter what she did, the sense of being observed never left her. It was like there was someone or something just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her every movement felt too deliberate, as though every step she took was being catalogued by an unseen presence. Then came the night it all escalated. Rachel had been lying in bed, trying to ignore the unsettling noise from the walls when she heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching the leaves outside her window. Her breath caught in her throat as she crept to the window, her heart pounding in her ears. She parted the blinds just enough to peer outside, but the yard was empty. No one was there. She strained her ears, listening for any other signs of movement. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The air felt thick with tension. She exhaled sharply, turning away from the window and telling herself she was imagining things. But as she walked back toward the hallway, she heard it again. This time from the door, the faintest scrape of a key turning in the lock. Rachel's blood ran cold. Her hand instinctively went to the phone in her pocket, but before she could unlock it, the door swung open. Rachel froze in place as the door creaked open. The soft scraping sound of metal against wood echoed through the hallway, and she felt a rush of panic course through her veins. Her mind raced, heart hammering in her chest. Had she left the door unlocked? She knew she hadn't. She was sure she hadn't. But there it was, wide open, as if someone had forced it. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of whether to run or hide. The silence that followed felt suffocating, like the world had stopped moving. The hairs on her neck prickled, and her eyes darted to the side, searching for any movement, any sign that someone, or something, was inside. She could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her, the stillness broken only by the sound of her own pulse pounding in her ears. With every second, the fear grew, thick and unbearable. Taking a deep breath, she took a cautious step forward, glancing around the corner of the hallway. The living room was empty. The front door remained ajar, the porch light casting long shadows across the floor. But there was no one in sight. No footsteps, no shadows lurking in the corners of the room. Just the quiet, the unsettling silence that seemed to echo off the walls. Her legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. But she pushed herself forward, inching closer to the door. As she approached the door, she reached out with trembling fingers, hesitating just for a moment before closing it softly behind her. The latch clicked into place, sealing her inside once more. She leaned against the door for a moment, her heart still racing, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. Was it Mr. Carver? Had he somehow gotten inside? But no, it didn't make sense. He didn't have a key, and the thought of him having broken in was almost laughable. The more she thought about it, the more she began to doubt herself. What if it was just the wind? What if she had imagined the sound of the door opening? But that wasn't the only thing she couldn't explain. That afternoon, Rachel had been sitting in her living room, drinking coffee, when she noticed a peculiar shadow on the wall. It had been so subtle at first that she almost dismissed it, but as the minutes passed, the shadow grew more defined. It was a long, tall figure standing just outside her window, half hidden by the curtains. She couldn't make out the details, but the shape was unmistakable. Pale, like the figure she had seen on the security footage. And just like the figure on the footage, it didn't move. It just stood there, staring back at her. Rachel hadn't dared to move, hadn't dared to blink, but the figure remained still. She wasn't sure how long she stared at it. Seconds, minutes, hours. But eventually, the shadow melted away. Just like that, as if it had never been there at all. She rushed to the window, but there was no sign of anyone outside. The yard was empty, still, as it always was. And yet, the unease gnawed at her. She had seen it. She had seen it with her own eyes. Rachel decided then that it was time to confront the neighbors. She needed to know if anyone else had seen anything strange, anything out of the ordinary. But as she knocked on Mr. Carver's door, her stomach twisted. She had never spoken to him directly before, but she had seen him around the neighborhood. Always polite, always friendly. The kind of person who seemed too good to be true. When Mr. Carver opened the door, his smile was warm, too warm, like it was practiced. "Oh, Rachel, what a pleasant surprise," he said, his voice smooth and cordial. "What can I do for you?" "Mr. Carver," Rachel began, her voice steady but her mind racing. I've been having some strange things happen around my house. Things I can't explain. I was wondering if you've noticed anything unusual around here." Mr. Carver's expression remained unchanged, his smile never faltering. "Strange things, you say," he replied, his tone just a little too calm, too rehearsed. "Well, I can't say I've noticed anything out of the ordinary, Rachel. But if you're worried, you know where to find me. Don't hesitate to ask." It was then that Rachel noticed something that made her stomach churn. He wasn't just standing there, smiling. His eyes were too wide, too intent. He was studying her, analyzing every word, every movement. And for the first time, Rachel felt that unsettling sensation of being under a microscope. She had thought she was imagining it before, but now she was sure of it. Mr. Carver was hiding something. The days following her conversation with Mr. Carver felt heavier, as though a cloud had settled over her life. Rachel tried to shake the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right, but no matter what she did, it lingered. The house, once a sanctuary, now seemed to whisper with an unease that she couldn't escape. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows felt like a threat, like someone was just waiting for her to let her guard down. But the worst part was the feeling that she wasn't alone. She couldn't shake the thought that Mr. Carver was involved somehow. His overly polite demeanor, his insistence that he hadn't noticed anything unusual. It was all too perfect, too rehearsed. But what could he possibly want with her? Why would he be watching her? Rachel had always been a woman of logic, someone who relied on reason and facts. She wasn't the type to jump to conclusions or entertain wild ideas. But the more she thought about it, the more everything seemed to add up. The strange shadows at the window, the noises at night, the way the lawn was always trampled, as if someone had been walking around it while she was inside. The feeling of being watched. It was all connected, and it all pointed to one man, Mr. Carver. With a sudden resolve, Rachel decided to take matters into her own hands. She installed a new set of cameras around her house, hoping to catch whatever, or whoever, was behind the strange occurrences. She couldn't just sit around and wait for something to happen. She needed proof, something solid to confirm her suspicions. That night, as she sat on the couch, watching the live feed from her new security system, her eyes scanned the dark corners of her yard. The cameras had a wider angle, and Rachel could see almost every inch of her property. Nothing unusual, just the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. But then she noticed something, a figure standing just outside her window. Her breath hitched in her throat as she leaned closer to the screen. The figure was tall, its shape more defined than it had been when she saw it through the curtains. Pale, almost ghostly, with sharp features that seemed out of place in the darkness. It was standing still, staring into her window, unmoving. Rachel's hand trembled as she reached for her phone to take a screenshot, but before she could, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing completely. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she replayed the footage over and over, her eyes scanning every pixel for any sign of movement. It was him. She knew it. Mr. Carver had been watching her again. But this time, she had proof. She wasn't imagining it. The next morning, Rachel decided to confront him once more. This time, she had the footage, the undeniable proof that he had been lurking outside her window, stalking her. She wasn't going to let him get away with it this time. But as she walked up to his front door, something stopped her. A cold chill ran down her spine, and she felt that familiar sense of dread creeping up her throat. She knocked, the sound echoing in the empty street. Moments later, the door opened, and there he was again, Mr. Carver, his smile as wide and practiced as ever. "Rachel, what can I do for you today?" His voice was too calm, too cheerful. It made her stomach churn. "I know what you've been doing," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that churned inside her. "I have footage. I've seen you outside my window. I know you've been watching me." His smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough to make Rachel's blood run cold. For a brief moment, there was something in his eyes. Something that wasn't right. Something dark. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by that same fake warmth. "Rachel, I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice almost soothing. "I've been nothing but friendly, just looking out for you. You're new to the neighborhood, and I wanted to make sure you were settling in okay." Rachel's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't buying it. Not anymore. "You've been watching me for weeks," she said, her voice rising. "I know what you're doing. You can't hide it anymore." But Mr. Carver just stood there, smiling. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Rachel," he said softly, "you've got it all wrong. I've been trying to help you. Why don't you come inside and talk about this? We can figure it out together." Rachel's skin crawled at the suggestion. She knew better than to step foot inside his house. Not now, not after everything that had happened. Something wasn't right. She had to get out of there. "I don't want to talk to you anymore," she said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "Stay away from me, Mr. Carver." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. It was as if he was weighing something in his mind. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned and closed the door in her face. Rachel stood there, heart pounding, her mind racing. She had confronted him. She had made it clear that she knew what he was doing. But now, more than ever, she knew she wasn't safe. The following days felt like a blur. Rachel tried to keep her distance from Mr. Carver, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was always watching, always waiting. Even though she had confronted him, she knew that he hadn't been deterred. The look in his eyes when he shut the door, that chilling calmness, had haunted her. It was as if he was already planning his next move, and she had just played right into his hands. She didn't feel safe anymore, not in her own home. The security cameras that had once been a sense of reassurance now felt like a cage, a reminder that someone was out there, lurking in the darkness, watching her every move. Rachel had taken to sleeping with the lights on, even though she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The house had become a prison, and she was the only inmate. The scratching sounds on the walls started again. At first, they were faint, like the sound of a branch scraping against the side of the house. But now, they were louder, more deliberate. Rachel would wake up in the middle of the night to hear them, like fingers running across the surface of the walls, always in the same spot. It was driving her to the edge of madness. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed help, but who could she trust? The police had brushed her off when she tried to explain what was happening. They had told her that there was nothing to worry about, that it was probably just an animal or some kids messing around. But Rachel knew better. She knew that it was Mr. Carver, and he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. One night, after hearing the scraping sounds again, Rachel decided she couldn't take it anymore. She needed to confront him one last time. But this time, she wouldn't be going alone. She called her friend Lily to come over and stay the night. Maybe having someone else there would help her feel safer, less vulnerable. But deep down, Rachel knew that safety was an illusion. There was no escaping what was happening. Lily arrived just before dusk, bringing with her a sense of calm that Rachel desperately needed. They talked for a while, trying to distract themselves from the tension that hung in the air. But as the sun set and darkness settled in, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the house felt colder, and every creak of the floorboards made her jump. She tried to ignore it, but the sense of dread only deepened as the night wore on. Around midnight, Rachel heard a faint noise coming from outside. It was a scraping sound like something being dragged across the ground. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She glanced at Lily, who was already looking at her with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Rachel nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what it was. It was Mr. Carver. He was out there, just beyond the window, waiting. But this time, Rachel wasn't going to wait for him to make the first move. She grabbed her phone and pulled up the security footage. Her hands shook as she watched the screen, and then she saw it. There, on the live feed, a shadow moving in the yard. It was tall, just like before, but now it was moving closer to the house. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she saw the figure stop directly outside her window, staring inside. Lily gasped, her eyes fixed on the screen. "What the hell is that?" Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. She knew exactly who it was. The shadowy figure was Mr. Carver, standing just outside her window, watching her. He had been doing this for weeks, and now it seemed like he was getting bolder, closer. Rachel didn't know how much longer she could stand it. She had to act. She couldn't just sit by and let him continue terrorizing her. She quickly grabbed the phone and dialed the police, her hands trembling as she spoke. "I need help. There's someone outside my house. They've been watching me for weeks. Please, you have to send someone." The operator assured her that help was on the way, but Rachel didn't feel reassured. She knew it would take too long for the police to get there. Mr. Carver would be long gone by then. She turned to Lily, her voice tight with fear. "We need to make sure he doesn't get away this time. We have to trap him." Lily looked at her, panic flashing in her eyes. "How? What do we do?" Rachel didn't have a clear plan. But the desperation in her voice gave her the courage to move. They couldn't just sit there and wait for him to make the next move. They needed to force his hand to get him to come inside where they could confront him once and for all. Rachel grabbed a heavy flashlight from the drawer and handed it to Lily. "We'll make sure he doesn't get away this time. Keep your phone ready. If anything happens, call the cops." With their hearts racing, they moved toward the back door, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The house seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing tighter with every step. They didn't know what would happen next, but they were ready for whatever came through that door. The darkness outside pressed in, suffocating in its intensity. Rachel's hands were slick with sweat as she gripped the flashlight, trying to steady her breath. Lily stood beside her, pale and trembling, but her resolve was firm. They knew this was the only chance to put an end to the nightmare that had consumed their lives. There was no more running, no more hiding. It was time to face Mr. Carver. Rachel pushed open the back door slowly, trying to avoid making a sound. The night air was cool, but it did nothing to ease the tension that had coiled tightly in her chest. The yard was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that comes right before something terrible happens. Rachel's eyes scanned the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the unsettling certainty that Carver was nearby. "Stay close," Rachel whispered to Lily, though her voice barely carried over the thick silence. She could see Lily nod, her face a mix of fear and determination. Together, they crept toward the edge of the property, where the trees stood like dark sentinels. The scratching sound from before had stopped, but Rachel knew better than to think he was gone. He was out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. They reached the spot where the yard met the woods. Rachel motioned for Lily to wait, then cautiously stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest. The beam from the flashlight cut through the darkness, but it did little to reveal the figure lurking in the shadows. Then she heard it. Soft footsteps behind her. Rachel spun around, but there was nothing there. Lily gasped, her breath coming in quick bursts. "What was that?" she whispered, voice quivering. Rachel didn't answer. She was too focused on the movement she'd caught from the corner of her eye. Just behind the trees, barely visible in the darkness, something shifted. A pale figure, almost ghostly in its stillness, stood motionless, staring directly at her. There was no mistaking it. It was Mr. Carver. Rachel's pulse spiked, and for a moment she froze. She wanted to call out to him, to demand answers, but she knew better. He wasn't just standing there for no reason. He was waiting for something, and she had no intention of letting him dictate the terms anymore. Taking a steadying breath, Rachel stepped forward, aiming the flashlight straight at him. "I know what you've been doing," she called out, her voice low but steady. "This ends tonight." The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, Mr. Carver's voice drifted through the night, cold and distant. "You think you can stop me? You think you can control this?" His words were calm, too calm, and Rachel could hear the faint tremor in his tone. It was as if he had rehearsed this moment in his mind for years. Lily, still behind her, gasped when she saw him clearly for the first time. "Oh my God," she breathed, her face going pale. "That's him. That's the guy who's been watching you." Rachel didn't take her eyes off Carver. "Stay behind me," she said to Lily, the words more of a command than a plea. Mr. Carver stepped forward, his long, thin frame emerging from the darkness. The faint moonlight caught his face, and Rachel saw the twisted smile on his lips. He was unarmed, but the way he moved, with such calculated ease, told her he didn't need any weapons. He was already a predator, and she was his prey. "You can't stop me," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper now. "You never could." The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the very woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't back down. "I'm not afraid of you." "Then why do you look so scared?" he taunted, his voice slipping into something more jagged, more unsettling. "You think the police will save you? They never come in time." Rachel's grip on the flashlight tightened, her knuckles white. She had no intention of waiting for the police. She knew they wouldn't arrive in time. This was her moment, her fight, and she was going to end it. In one swift motion, Rachel raised the flashlight and swung it toward him. But Carver was too quick, his long arms grabbing her by the wrist before she could land a hit. For a split second, she felt the coldness of his grip, the strength that belied his frail appearance. But she wasn't going to let him overpower her. With a surge of adrenaline, Rachel twisted her wrist free and slammed the flashlight into his side. He stumbled back, momentarily disoriented, and that's when Rachel lunged, pushing him backward with all her strength. "Get away from her," Lily shouted, her voice barely audible but filled with a desperation Rachel hadn't heard before. Carver fell hard into the grass, momentarily stunned. But as he scrambled to get up, Rachel acted quickly. She grabbed the rope they had brought with them and used it to tie his hands together, securing him before he could fully regain his footing. She wasn't going to take any chances. "Help me tie him up," she said to Lily, who was frozen in place, watching in disbelief. It was only when Rachel turned to her that Lily snapped out of it, rushing forward to help. By the time the police arrived, Mr. Carver was restrained and lying on the ground, his expression one of rage and frustration. He had lost, and he knew it. But Rachel couldn't bring herself to feel triumphant. The terror of the past months still gripped her, a gnawing feeling that wouldn't let go. As the officers took Carver into custody, Rachel felt the weight of everything she had just survived. He was gone, but she knew that the scars would remain. For now, at least, she was free from him. But part of her wondered, would she ever truly be free? The memory of his presence, of his eyes always watching, would haunt her for the rest of her life. Moving into a new house should feel like a fresh start. At least, that's what I thought as I stood on the porch of the old Victorian, the one my late aunt had left me. The neighbors waved at me as I unloaded boxes, their faces smiling, but carrying that curious, almost watchful expression. The neighborhood was picture perfect. Trees lining the streets, houses well kept, and the kind of peace that you only see in postcards. I thought I'd found my sanctuary. The first oddity came a few days after I'd settled in. Mr. Calloway, the elderly man next door, had shown up with a gift, an antique pocket watch. He told me it was special, a family heirloom passed down through generations. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just his way of introducing himself. But then it happened again. A vase, a silver ring, a framed painting of a sunset. Each gift came with the same line, "It's special, you'll see." The man was kind, but there was something unsettling about him, the way he stared at me as if he were measuring something. I should have been grateful for the gifts. People don't give things away for nothing these days. But something about the items felt wrong. They weren't just old, they were too perfect. Untouched by time, as though they hadn't aged at all. I began to notice small details. The pocket watch ticking without winding, the vase that always smelled faintly of flowers despite being empty, the ring that seemed to shift its weight when no one was looking. It wasn't just eccentricity, there was something deliberate behind his actions. The house itself didn't help. It creaked at night in ways I hadn't expected. The floors groaned under my weight, the wind howled through the old chimneys. But more than that, it was the silence. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. One evening, I decided to visit Mr. Calloway, figuring I could thank him for the most recent trinket. A small, intricately carved wooden box. I knocked on his door, and he opened it almost immediately, as though he'd been waiting for me. His smile was too wide, and his eyes gleamed in a way that made my skin crawl. "Come in, Olivia," he said, gesturing toward the dimly lit interior. "I've been meaning to show you something." I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside, the scent of old wood and dust thick in the air. As he led me into the back of his house, I froze. There, in the dim glow of a single light bulb, was his collection. The garage was a museum of the macabre. A display of objects meticulously arranged, each with an eerie, personal connection to someone in the neighborhood. The paintings, the jewelry, even a broken mirror from a house down the street, were all laid out with disturbing care. But what caught my eye, more than anything else, was the center of the room. It was a table covered with objects I had recognized, things I thought I'd lost long ago, each one tied to events in my life, memories I couldn't explain. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Each item on the table seemed like a piece of my life, memories I had forgotten or perhaps buried too deep. A photograph of me as a child, sitting in front of my grandmother's house. A set of keys I hadn't seen in years, the same ones I had lost when I moved to the house. A single shoe, worn and faded, from the time I twisted my ankle running through the park. It was impossible. How could he have these things? "Mr. Calloway, where did you get these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I told you, Olivia, they're special. All of them are. The pieces of you." My blood ran cold. He wasn't just collecting things. He was collecting parts of my past, like a twisted scavenger picking through the wreckage of my life. I couldn't understand it. Why me? Why was I the target of this strange obsession? His eyes glinted in the dim light. "Everything has meaning. Everything tells a story, and I've been collecting them for years." He gestured toward the far wall, where I noticed the edges of more objects, more things covered by sheets. I felt an involuntary shiver crawl up my spine. "Would you like to see more?" I should have said no. I should have turned and walked out of that garage, out of that house, and never looked back. But something inside me pushed me forward, curiosity outweighing my fear. I nodded, though my stomach twisted in dread. Mr. Calloway led me down a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were lined with shelves, each shelf stacked with odd objects. Trinkets, books, strange carvings, old letters, each one meticulously catalogued. He pushed open a door at the end of the hall and gestured for me to enter. The room was unlike anything I had seen before. It was a small, dark space, lit only by the faint glow of a single lamp. But the real horror wasn't the dim lighting or the musty smell. It was what lay inside. On every surface, tables, shelves, even the floor, were more objects. More personal items, all from people who lived on this street, maybe even from people who had lived here before. Each object seemed to be linked to a tragedy or a trauma. Items that had witnessed something horrific. A blood-stained jacket. A broken doll with its head twisted backward. A journal filled with pages torn from another's life. I stumbled back, my mind racing. "What is this place? Why are you doing this?" Mr. Calloway stepped forward, his face softening for the first time. "I collect, Olivia. Not just things, but memories. The essence of a person. You see, when you collect enough pieces, you can begin to piece together the story. The truth behind the life. It's a very powerful thing." I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my legs felt frozen, like they were rooted to the spot. I was trapped, surrounded by pieces of people's lives, trapped in this house with a man who seemed to have crossed some invisible line, a line between obsession and madness. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to choke out. His voice dropped, becoming almost a whisper. "Because memories are the most precious thing we have, and I've learned how to keep them forever." That's when I understood. Mr. Calloway wasn't just collecting things. He was collecting people's lives, trapping them in time, preserving them in a grotesque museum of memories. And now, somehow, I was a part of it. I felt my breath quicken, my chest tightening as the realization hit me. I wasn't just another collector's item in his twisted museum. I was a part of something far darker. Mr. Calloway wasn't simply obsessed with possessions or memories. He was rewriting history. Using the objects, the keepsakes, the personal items he'd stolen, he was crafting stories. Distorted versions of people's lives, and I was no different. "Why me?" I whispered, the words barely forming on my lips as I backed away from the horrifying display around me. Mr. Calloway smiled, though it wasn't comforting. It wasn't even kind. "It's not just you, Olivia. It's never been just you. You're part of the story now, but you were always meant to be. Every person who's ever lived here has contributed to this collection." He gestured to the items surrounding us, his voice low and reverent. "Each piece is like a page in a book. You can see the narrative unfold." I stared at him, trying to piece together the madness in his words. Each item, a simple trinket, a forgotten book, a misplaced key, was part of a puzzle he had constructed, a puzzle of pain, memories, and stolen pieces of souls. The horrifying thought gripped me. Did he ever truly leave anyone alone? Was there ever a point in time when he didn't lurk in the shadows, collecting the remnants of lives, building his grotesque collection? His next words were softer, but they sliced through the air like a knife. "You've noticed, haven't you? The way the neighbors come and go, how people vanish, how you can never quite remember why. I'm the keeper of their stories, their forgotten parts, the pieces they wish to erase." Suddenly, it hit me. Mr. Calloway wasn't just a collector of objects. He was a collector of the past. Of the unspoken, the buried, the inconvenient truths of people's lives. He kept the broken, the shameful, the darkened corners of everyone's existence. And when someone disappeared, he didn't just let them go. He kept them. He kept their stories. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was I his latest prize? His newest victim? You. I choked on the words. You made them disappear. Mr. Calloway's smile was enigmatic. I didn't make them disappear, Olivia. I merely preserved them. I gave them a home, a place to live forever. I didn't know what to say. How could I? The idea of being a part of his collection, of my life being reduced to a display in his twisted museum, was suffocating. His obsession wasn't just with objects, it was with control, with the ability to freeze time and make people his forever. And now, standing in that room, I understood the depth of his insanity. My eyes scanned the room once more, my gaze landing on an old rocking chair in the corner. It was familiar. I had seen it before. When I was younger, it belonged to my grandmother. I'd spent countless hours sitting in it, listening to her stories of the past. But this one, it wasn't my grandmother's chair. It couldn't be. It's all right, Olivia, Mr. Calloway said, his voice soothing. You'll be here with me, and I'll take care of you. You're part of the collection now. You'll never have to forget. You'll never be lost. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This man, this sick, twisted man, was keeping pieces of everyone. Pieces of their lives, their essence. And now he wanted me to become a part of his collection too. I'm not like them, I said, the words trembling out of me. Mr. Calloway's smile deepened. Oh, but you are. You just don't realize it yet. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out, fingers grazing my arm like a spider's web. All of us are. I knew then that I had to leave. Before I became nothing more than another forgotten memory in his collection. Panic clawed at my chest as Mr. Calloway's words echoed in my mind. All of us are. The suffocating truth that I was no different from the other lost souls he'd hoarded gripped me like a vice. But even in my terror, I couldn't help but notice how detached he seemed, how his obsession with the collection had consumed him entirely. He no longer saw people as individuals. We were simply pieces in his grotesque puzzle. My pulse quickened as I looked around, scanning the room for any chance to escape. The door was still locked, the key nowhere in sight. But I knew I couldn't stay here, not with him so close, not with his promises of being part of his collection weighing on me like a suffocating blanket. I had to think fast. I needed a way out, and I needed it now. Where's the key? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady, my eyes fixed on Mr. Calloway. He watched me, a strange satisfaction gleaming in his eyes, as if he enjoyed the fear he saw in mine. Key? He asked, feigning innocence. The key is unnecessary. There's no need for you to leave. You're part of something much bigger now. I shook my head, my frustration bubbling over. You're crazy. You think you can just take people's lives, their memories, and make them yours. His gaze darkened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of anger beneath his calm demeanor. You don't understand, Olivia. This isn't about control. It's about preservation. I'm offering you a chance to live forever, beyond time, beyond memory. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as his words wrapped around me like chains. I had to get out of there before I became another forgotten piece in his twisted collection. I glanced around the room again. The windows were high up, unreachable, and the walls were covered in shelves laden with objects. Each one a memory, a stolen piece of someone's soul. My eyes fell on the fireplace, a large, looming structure in the center of the room. My heart skipped a beat as I noticed a faint glimmer in the dark recesses of the chimney. It was small, barely noticeable, but I could just make out the outline of something metallic. A grate? The fireplace? It was my only option. Listen to me, Mr. Calloway, I said, my voice low but firm. You've collected enough. You've built your twisted museum, but I'm not staying here. I'm leaving, and you can't stop me. He took a step toward me, his face contorting with irritation. You think you can escape, Olivia? You're mine now, and there's nowhere you can run that will keep you safe. But I wasn't listening anymore. I turned on my heel, my heart pounding in my chest, and sprinted toward the fireplace. My hands trembled as I searched for a way to break open the grate. But just as my fingers brushed against it, a sharp cry echoed in the room. No, Mr. Calloway shouted, his voice shaking with fury. I didn't have time to think. I shoved against the grate with all my strength, and with a loud crack, it gave way. The cold night air rushed into the room, and I could feel the taste of freedom in my mouth. I didn't care how I got out, only that I did. But as I started to climb through the opening, I heard him again, closer this time. "You'll never escape me, Olivia," he warned, his voice low and filled with menace. "You'll always be mine." I didn't stop to argue. My body screamed in protest as I scrambled through the narrow chimney, my hands and knees scraping against the rough stone walls. My heart hammered in my chest as I finally tumbled out into the yard, the night air cold and sharp against my skin. I stumbled to my feet, gasping for breath, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had to get as far away from him as I could. I ran through the dark yard, the moon casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. The house loomed behind me, a dark, looming presence that seemed to watch my every move. My legs burned, my breath ragged, but I kept running. I couldn't let him catch me. I couldn't let him take me back. The front gate was only a few steps away when I heard the faintest sound. A soft scraping noise like the rustle of paper. My heart stopped. I turned, and there he was. Mr. Calloway, standing at the front door of the house, watching me with that same disturbing smile. His eyes were wide manic, his hands trembling as he held out a small object. A key. "Don't think you can run forever, Olivia," he said, his voice low but carrying in the still night air. "You'll be back. They always come back." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and bolted, my feet pounding against the dirt road, the weight of his words lingering in the air like a cold, suffocating mist. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to leave. I had to get away from him, from the collection, from the dark madness that had taken root in that house. But even as I ran, I knew one thing for certain. Mr. Calloway wasn't done with me, and he never would be. The night swallowed me whole as I ran, the darkness pressing in on all sides. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale a desperate plea for air. My legs ached, my body trembling from the sheer force of my panic. But the words that haunted me were not the ones Mr. Calloway had spoken. They were the ones I'd heard in my own mind, ever since I'd discovered the true horror of his collection. "You'll always be mine." I couldn't escape that thought. No matter how fast I ran, how far I went, it felt as though something was chasing me. Something far worse than Mr. Calloway. The idea that I might never truly be free. That no matter what I did, my life had already been written into the twisted tapestry of his obsession. But I couldn't let that stop me. I couldn't give in. I pushed through the brush and into the woods, the trees standing like silent sentinels in the moonlight. My mind raced, desperately searching for any plan, any way to stop the nightmare that had unfolded in that house. But all I could think of was the room. The room filled with things that didn't belong to me, memories that weren't mine. I stumbled on uneven ground, my foot catching on a tree root. I cried out, falling hard onto the dirt. For a moment I couldn't move, my body too exhausted, my mind too clouded with fear. But I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let him find me. Shakily, I got to my feet, wiping the dirt from my hands. My heart pounded in my chest, a constant reminder that I was running out of time. The adrenaline had taken its toll, but there was no turning back now. I had to find a way to destroy the collection, to destroy him. I thought back to the room, the fireplace. The fire had been my only chance, my only weapon. But it hadn't been enough. I knew now that there had to be more to the house than I'd realized. There had to be something else. Something hidden, something I could use to finish this. As I stumbled through the woods, the faint glow of the house's windows illuminated the trees behind me. I could see it. See the faint outline of the structure through the branches. I hadn't gone far, and the thought of going back to the house filled me with dread, but I knew there was no other choice. I couldn't let him win. I turned and ran back toward the house, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The closer I got, the more I felt it. A pull, an unseen force that seemed to draw me back. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. I had one chance, and this time I wouldn't hesitate. I reached the edge of the yard, crouching low in the shadows, my breath shallow as I watched the house. Mr. Calloway was nowhere to be seen. I crept forward, my body tense, every step a careful calculation. The windows were dark now, the door still ajar. I had to get inside. I had to destroy everything. I pushed through the front gate, stepping softly onto the porch. The door creaked open as if welcoming me back. It was almost too easy. Inside, the house was eerily silent. I could hear my own heartbeat in the quiet, thumping in my chest like a drum. The flickering remnants of the fire in the fireplace cast long shadows across the room. I didn't hesitate. I moved toward the hidden room, the place where it all started, the place where he'd kept his collection. The door was still locked, but that didn't matter. I knew what I had to do. My fingers found the edges of the door, and with a forceful shove, it swung open. The sight that greeted me made my stomach turn. The shelves, the trinkets, the memories, everything was still there. But this time, there was something different. A smell, acrid and burning, hung in the air. I could hear the faint crackling of flames, and my eyes fell to the fireplace. The fire was growing, the flames licking at the edges of the room, devouring everything in their path. And then I saw him. Mr. Calloway stood by the fire, his eyes wide with manic glee, as if the destruction of his collection was some grand spectacle. His hands were trembling, his body hunched forward as he watched the flames consume everything he had built. "Do you see, Olivia?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "This is the end, but not for me. I'll always be here. I'll always be a part of you." I didn't listen. I couldn't. I moved toward the fire, my heart racing, my mind fixed on one goal. The collection had to burn. It had to be destroyed. Without thinking, I grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and threw it onto the flames. The fire grew higher, more furious, as if it knew it was fighting for its life. Mr. Calloway's laughter echoed through the room, but it was cut short as the fire began to spread. The room was ablaze now, the heat suffocating, the smoke thick in the air. I had to get out. I had to survive. I turned and ran for the door, my lungs burning with every breath, but before I could make it, I heard him scream. "Olivia!" His voice was full of rage, but it was too late. The fire had already claimed him. I ran into the night, away from the house, away from the inferno that was now consuming everything. As I looked back, the flames rose higher, casting an eerie glow into the sky. But the nightmare was over, for now. I didn't know what had happened to the house or to the collection, but I knew one thing. I had survived. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lurking in the shadows. I wasn't free. Not yet. The days after the fire felt strange. Disconnected, like I was still walking through a dream. I had left the house behind, watching it burn to the ground, but the haunting memories refused to leave me. They lingered in the back of my mind, pulling at me in ways I couldn't explain. The police had investigated the fire. They said it was an accident, a tragic case of an old man's obsession with antiques getting out of hand. They never found Mr. Calloway's body, though. Just ash and charred remains. It didn't make sense. I'd seen him die, but there was no trace of him in the wreckage. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, like he was never there to begin with. I tried to move on, to forget about the house, but it was impossible. The nightmares came every night, vivid and relentless. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing as if I had been running from something I couldn't escape. The images of the hidden room, the collection, and Mr. Calloway's maddening laughter all flooded my mind in waves. I could almost hear his voice, faint and distant, calling to me from somewhere deep within the recesses of my thoughts. It didn't help that the neighborhood had changed after the fire. The streets felt quieter, the houses darker, as if the town itself had been affected by what had happened. The people who lived there no longer spoke to me the way they once had. I was an outsider now, a stranger in my own home. The neighbors would glance at me with wary eyes, as if they knew something I didn't. And in a way, I knew they did. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something. Something important. The way Mr. Calloway had looked at me, the way he had tried to control me with his strange gifts and odd trinkets. It was as though he had been preparing me for something. Something I wasn't ready to face. One evening, as I walked through the neighborhood, I passed by Mr. Calloway's old house. Now nothing more than a burned-out shell. The remains of the foundation still stood, blackened and broken. It should have been a relief to see it gone, but instead, it filled me with a sense of dread. I couldn't stop staring at the ruins, as though some part of me still believed that something was waiting inside, something I had failed to destroy. I tried to shake the feeling off, to keep moving forward, but every step felt heavier. My mind was plagued by the idea that the collection was still out there, somewhere. That even though the physical objects had been burned, the memories, the essence of them, still existed. And maybe, just maybe, the collection had never been about the things at all. Maybe it had been about the people, about me. A few days later, I received a letter. It was old-fashioned, hand-delivered to my doorstep. the envelope sealed with wax. Inside, there was nothing but a single piece of paper. A note scrawled in handwriting that was unmistakable. "I'm not finished with you, Olivia." The words hit me like a physical blow, sending a chill down my spine. I stared at the note for what felt like hours, the air thick with the weight of it. I had to know. I had to find out what this meant. I couldn't live in fear anymore. I couldn't keep running from the past. The memories of Mr. Calloway, his twisted obsession, the fire. It all felt so close, like I could reach out and touch it, like it was still happening. But it was impossible, wasn't it? The house was gone. The man was gone. Yet the message remained. He was still out there, somewhere, watching. I began to search through my own belongings, things I had thought were normal. Trinkets, keepsakes, photographs, anything that might hold a clue. And then I found it. Tucked away in an old box, hidden beneath years of dust, was one of Mr. Calloway's gifts. A small, delicate pendant shaped like an owl. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. I hadn't remembered receiving it, but I knew it was his. I had seen that exact pendant in his garage, displayed in the exact same place as every other item he had ever given me. It had always seemed harmless, just another odd trinket from the man I thought was just eccentric. But now it felt like something far darker, a connection to something far more sinister. The pendant felt heavy in my hand, as though it had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just a piece of jewelry. It was a reminder. A reminder that no matter how much I tried to leave it all behind, I would always be part of Mr. Calloway's collection. And somewhere, in the dark corners of my mind, I heard his voice again. A whisper, soft and insistent. "You'll always be mine." The realization hit me like a wave. The collection wasn't just about objects or memories. It was about people. It was about control. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how many times I tried to escape, I would never truly be free. Mr. Calloway had made sure of that. I had a very creepy neighbor once. I actually ended up breaking my lease over how much he creeped me out. He had a bit of an uncanniness about him. It was mainly his pupils, while they were round. I can't really say they were circular. It was almost as if they were being flexed into a more round shape than they would naturally look without putting in effort. His eyes were always straining. There were also the veins. For all the marijuana smell coming from his apartment, his beady little eyes never really had the red hue. It was always a bit more bluish. I don't think he actually smoked marijuana. I always had a gut feeling that the smell was just a cover-up for a more sinister smell. His voice was also very strange. We didn't speak much, but when we did, it almost sounded like he was multiple people at once. One time I saw him talking to some other creepily similar-looking dude in the hall, and I swear his mouth didn't even move. He always had people coming in and out of his apartment, though I definitely feel like I've seen more people enter than leave. I'm not exactly sure what they were getting up to in there, but I've always been the live and let live type, so I never questioned them. Sometimes I wish I did. For all his creepy features and haunting presence, nothing can compare to the fear I felt when I went to confront him about some weird chant he was doing late into the night with his creepy friends. I always figured the guy was into occultism, and usually that wouldn't bother me. But it was now midnight, and I had to get up early for work. When I left my apartment to go knock on his door, I noticed a shimmering glow coming from below the gap below. I was a bit scared, but I figured he probably just had the TV on or one of those color-changing LED strips. Then came the smell. It was a chemical smell mixed with putrid marine rot, and it grew very intense, causing my sinuses to burn. My eyes began to water profusely as I lifted my hand to knock on the door. But my arm felt too heavy, as did the rest of my body. The walls began to melt and breathe, almost as if I were tripping, and I collapsed on the floor. As I laid on the ground, the chanting grew louder and stranger. I don't know what they were saying, but the sounds didn't sound like anything humans should be able to produce. Everything in my vision began to melt away into an inky blackness, when suddenly the chanting was accompanied by some strange piping instrument sound and the monstrous pounding beating of drums. I shrieked out in pain as the heavy gravity faded, and my very blood felt as if it were starting to crystallize. Have you ever been shocked so badly you couldn't move? That's sort of what it felt like when I lost total control of my body and began to twist and contort into a hellish dance. I don't know how long I painfully danced to that horrible eldritch symphony alone in the blackness. I went completely mad as time began to lose all meaning. The piping and drumming got so loud that I thought the sound would tear my flesh apart. That's when I felt the demonic presence of something truly horrible beyond comprehension looming just over my head. Suddenly, I was completely overcome with a pain that felt like every single cell in my body was crystallizing, and I felt the strangest mix of fear and nostalgia. I did not want to look up, but I had no choice. By the mercy of God, I have no recollection of what happened after this. All I remember is my head starting to turn towards the sky. Then I blacked out. I woke up in my kitchen at 12:01 a.m., only about a minute after the time I got up to go confront my neighbor, and there was no more chanting or sound. I nervously got up and peeked out my door, not sure whether or not I should feel relieved at the lack of light and smell coming from under the neighbor's door. I quit my job that day and moved back home within a week. I wish I could forget that experience, but I still hear that rhythm sometimes when it's quiet. I have also been sleepwalking every now and then since that night. I set up a camera once, when I checked the footage and saw myself doing that hellish dance, and vowed to never record myself again. The worst reminder, however, is my new boss who has the same weird thing going on. I've never been one for quiet neighborhoods. I was born and raised in the city, where the hum of traffic and the voices of people create a constant rhythm. But when Susan and I decided to buy our first home, we wanted something different. Something serene, so we found it. This quiet suburban area where the streets are lined with towering oak trees and the houses sit comfortably apart from one another. The kind of place that, on paper, looks perfect. We'd been looking for months, but the moment we stepped inside the old Victorian house, I knew it was the one. It was bigger than anything we'd ever imagined, with creaky wooden floors and an overgrown garden that looked like something out of a Gothic novel. The house had character. It felt like it had a history, even though the realtor had assured us it was only built in the 1930s. Our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Elston, seemed to have lived here for decades. You couldn't miss her. Sitting on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching us with intense, almost piercing eyes. She never waved or said much. Just sat there, always staring as we moved in, unpacked, and started our new life. Susan, of course, didn't think anything of it. She was the type who could find beauty in everything. Me? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about Mrs. Elston. The first time I spoke to her, I tried to make small talk. "How long have you lived here?" I asked, trying to be friendly. She smiled faintly, her lips tight. "Decades," she said, her voice as thin as the air between the trees. "This neighborhood's been through a lot." It was an odd response, but I shrugged it off. After all, I was a man who believed in moving forward, not looking back. Yet, as the days wore on, I couldn't help but feel uneasy whenever I saw her sitting on that porch. There was something in her eyes, a sharpness, that made me uneasy. It was like she was watching us for a reason, but I couldn't figure out why. A few nights later, as we sat in the living room, I mentioned it to Susan. "Do you ever get the feeling that Mrs. Elston's watching us?" Susan laughed, not even glancing up from her book. "You're just imagining things. She's just an old woman, James. Probably lonely." I wanted to believe her. But the truth was, I couldn't stop feeling that the old woman knew something we didn't. Something that made our new house feel less like a dream and more like a trap. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the hallway. I rolled over, expecting Susan to be asleep beside me, but she wasn't. The tapping continued, faint but distinct. My skin prickled. Something wasn't right. I didn't get out of bed. But the next morning, when I checked the house, everything seemed fine. No signs of anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding in the walls of this house. Something that didn't want to be discovered. I told myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew it was only the beginning. And that, somehow, Mrs. Elston was at the center of it all. The days blurred together after that night, each one feeling just like the last. We were still adjusting to the house, unpacking boxes, getting settled. Susan seemed to enjoy the quiet. She spent her days painting and organizing, while I tackled the repairs and odd jobs. But there was something gnawing at me, a persistent unease that I couldn't shake. Every time I walked past Mrs. Elston's house, she'd be there, sitting on the porch, staring as if she were waiting for something, or someone. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences began. At first, it was little things. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter only to find them moved later in the day. Or the front door, which I always locked when we left, would be unlocked when we returned. I'd check the locks, thinking I had forgotten, but Susan was convinced I was just being paranoid. "You're too worried, James," she'd say, shaking her head with a smile. "It's an old house. Things creak, they shift. It's nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. One morning, I found a small porcelain doll sitting on the kitchen table. I was certain I hadn't left it there. Susan hadn't bought it. Neither of us had seen it before. The doll was unsettling. Its eyes too wide, its smile too forced. I asked Susan if she had placed it there as some sort of joke. She looked at me, confused. "No," she said, her voice soft. "I haven't even seen that thing before." I stared at the doll for a long time, trying to figure out how it got there. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something even stranger. I couldn't remember when I'd last seen the kitchen empty. When I'd left it the previous evening, it had been bare. The doll shouldn't have been there, but it was. And it wasn't the only thing. The house seemed to have a way of shifting, rearranging things when we weren't looking. Books would be moved from one shelf to another. A painting would be askew when it had been perfectly straight the day before. At night, Susan would sometimes complain of hearing whispers, faint voices that she couldn't place. I tried to convince her it was just the wind, the old house settling. But the more I ignored it, the more it all added up. One evening, after another round of strange noises, I decided to confront Mrs. Elston. I walked over to her house, my heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and dread. When I reached her porch, she looked up at me, her eyes sharp as always. "Is something wrong, James?" she asked, her voice quiet but deliberate. I don't know how to say this," I began, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "There's something wrong with the house. Strange things are happening, and I think you know something about it." She didn't answer at first, just stared at me as if weighing her options. Then, finally, she spoke in a low, almost reverent tone. "The children never leave." I froze. "The children? What did she mean by that?" "Who are the children?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Elston's face softened for a moment, her eyes distant, as if lost in a memory. "They were here long before you came, and they will be here long after you're gone." I didn't know what to make of her cryptic words. I tried to ask more, but she just smiled faintly, the same unsettling look on her face. "Some things are better left forgotten," she said before turning away, disappearing inside her house without another word. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door she had closed behind her. "The children never leave." The phrase echoed in my mind, growing louder and louder with every passing minute. That night, unable to sleep, I went through the old neighborhood records I'd found in the attic, hoping to uncover some piece of the house's history that could explain what was happening. As I flipped through the brittle pages, I came across a reference to the building's past. Something that made my blood run cold. The house had once been home to an orphanage. In the 1920s, there had been a fire that had claimed the lives of dozens of children. But there was more. A note about an unnamed caregiver who had been responsible for the children's care, someone whose guilt had lingered long after the flames had died. I closed the record with trembling hands. Mrs. Elston had never mentioned this. But now it all made sense. She had been there. She had been the caregiver. And those children, trapped in that fire, were still here, still lingering in the house, waiting for something. I couldn't stop myself from going back to Mrs. Elston's porch the next day. I had to know more. The days after that conversation with Mrs. Elston were a blur of uncertainty. The house, which had once seemed so charming, now felt like a prison. Susan tried to go about her daily routine, but she was growing more and more unsettled. The whispers she'd been hearing at night had become more frequent, louder, as though something was trying to speak to her, something not entirely human. She insisted on leaving lights on in every room, and even though I told her it was unnecessary, I couldn't shake the same feeling of being watched. The doll on the kitchen table still haunted me. Every time I passed it, its painted eyes seemed to follow me. But that wasn't the only thing that unnerved me. There was a strange coldness to certain parts of the house now. Cold spots that would appear for no reason, as though the air itself had thickened and hardened into something unnatural. I spent my nights combing through the town's historical records, searching for anything that could explain what Mrs. Elston had said. I went to the local library, digging through the brittle newspapers from the 1920s. That was when I found it. A news article dated just days after the fire at the orphanage. The headline was simple, almost too straightforward. Tragedy strikes local orphanage. Dozens of children perish in blaze. The article gave the bare facts. How the orphanage had burned to the ground in the dead of night, trapping the children inside. The fire had spread too quickly for anyone to escape. But what caught my attention wasn't the tragedy itself. It was the line buried in the middle of the article that mentioned the orphanage caregiver, a woman by the name of Agnes Elston. She had been arrested after the fire but released shortly afterward, the authorities claiming there wasn't enough evidence to charge her. The article didn't explain why, but the implication was clear. Something had gone horribly wrong. Agnes Elston. It was Mrs. Elston. The same woman sitting on her porch watching us. My gut twisted with the realization. She wasn't just a bystander in the tragedy. She had been the one responsible for those children, the one who had failed to save them. And now she was here. Still living in the same neighborhood, still watching, still haunted by the past. I went back to the house late that night, desperate for answers. The house was cold, silent, but there was an oppressive weight to the air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked through the rooms, checking every corner, until I reached the attic, the one place I hadn't explored thoroughly. It was dusty, filled with old furniture and boxes, but something about it felt different now, almost alive. As I sifted through the boxes, I found a small wooden chest. It was old, the wood darkened with age, but it didn't seem like something that should have been hidden away. I opened it cautiously, my heart pounding. Inside, I found several items that made my skin crawl. Handwritten letters, yellowed photographs of children, and a strange collection of toys, many of them broken or worn down by time. But what really stood out to me were the drawings. The children had drawn pictures. Pictures of the house, pictures of Mrs. Elston, and pictures of themselves. In every drawing, the children were crying, their faces twisted in fear and pain. I felt a sharp chill run down my spine. This wasn't just a collection of old memorabilia. These were memories, trapped memories preserved by some twisted force. I could almost feel the children's anguish as I stared at their drawings. That's when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched laugh echoing through the attic. It was soft, almost playful, but there was something horribly wrong about it. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, flickering in the dim light of the attic. I slammed the chest shut, heart racing, and stumbled back down the stairs. The house felt alive now, as if the walls were closing in around me, pressing down on me. The laughter still echoed in my mind, growing louder, more insistent. When I returned to the living room, Susan was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. I rushed over to her, shaking her gently, but she didn't respond. It was like she wasn't even there. "Susan," I said, my voice cracking with fear. "Susan, what's happening?" She finally turned to look at me, but there was something in her eyes. Something hollow, something that wasn't her. Her voice came out in a whisper, barely audible, as if she were speaking from a great distance. "They want me to stay. They want me to be with them." I grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her harder. "What are you talking about? Who wants you to stay?" Her head tilted to the side, her lips curling into a strange, eerie smile. "The children, they never leave. They want me to join their family." I backed away, my blood running cold. The house was no longer just a home. It was something far worse, and I was starting to realize that Mrs. Elston wasn't just watching us. She was waiting for us. Waiting for Susan. I couldn't shake the image of Susan's hollow eyes and that eerie smile. It wasn't her. This wasn't the woman I'd married, the woman who had filled our home with laughter and love. Something had changed. Something dark and ancient had taken hold of her. That night, I stayed awake, pacing the floors, unable to sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper in the wind, seemed to be feeding into the growing dread that something terrible was about to happen. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine. Susan, on the other hand, seemed almost at peace. She sat in the living room, staring out the window, her fingers twitching as if she were playing with something unseen. The days that followed only made things worse. Susan was slipping away, her thoughts no longer her own. I'd catch her talking softly to herself, murmuring in a language I didn't recognize. She would wander the house at night, her steps silent, her eyes vacant like a sleepwalker. And all the while, I could feel Mrs. Elston's presence hanging over us like a storm cloud, watching, waiting. Desperate, I returned to the historical records, trying to understand what kind of curse had taken hold of my wife. That's when I came across the true horror. The final detail of the orphanage fire that no one had bothered to explain. The building wasn't just an orphanage. It was a place where children had been kept, not just as wards of the state, but as subjects of a twisted experiment in control and manipulation. Mrs. Elston had been a caregiver, yes, but she had been far more than that. She had been the one who controlled them, controlled the children, feeding them on guilt, on fear, until they became something else entirely. Something that wouldn't die. The fire had not just claimed their lives. It had bound their souls to the land itself. And now, decades later, those souls were calling out, calling for new recruits. They were looking for someone to replace them, someone to join their twisted, ghostly family. And Susan was the one they had chosen. I had to act. I couldn't let her become another part of Mrs. Elston's collection. The memories, the spirits, they weren't just trapped here. They were manipulating her, pulling her further and further into their world. The line between the living and the dead was starting to blur, and I was afraid that if I didn't do something, Susan would be lost forever. I confronted Mrs. Elston in her yard the next morning. She was sitting on her usual spot on the porch, her eyes watching me like a hawk. She didn't smile this time. Instead, she just stared, as if she knew what I was about to say. "What have you done to her?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. Mrs. Elston didn't move, but her gaze never left me. "You think you can save her?" she asked, her voice thick with a tone I couldn't quite place. "You think you can take her from them?" "They're not her family," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "She's not one of them. She's my wife." "The children never leave," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "They don't need to. They only want to be remembered. And once they have you, you'll never leave either." I felt a cold shiver run through me, a deep, gnawing feeling that something far worse was about to happen. Mrs. Elston's words were like poison, sinking deep into my bones. The children weren't just dead. They were lingering, feeding on the living, using them as vessels for their sorrow and pain. "I won't let you have her," I spat, my chest tightening with the weight of the truth I was starting to understand. "Whatever you've done to her, I'll undo it. I'll burn this house down if I have to." Mrs. Elston didn't flinch. She didn't react at all. Instead, she simply stood, her frail body moving with unnatural speed as she approached me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I saw it. The darkness that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. "The fire never finished," she said softly. "The children never leave, James, and neither will you." Before I could react, she turned and walked back into the house, leaving me standing there, frozen with fear. I felt the weight of her words settle into me, as though they were a warning, a threat that I couldn't escape. But I wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not after everything we'd been through. I had to save Susan, even if it meant destroying the house, destroying the spirits, destroying everything that had been built on this cursed land. The children wanted her. But I was going to take her back. I didn't sleep that night. There was no way I could, not with Susan slipping further into the grip of whatever dark force was taking hold of her. The house was quieter than usual, as if it too knew something terrible was about to happen. The walls seemed to close in on me, every creak, every whisper, a reminder that time was running out. The next morning, I began preparing. I knew what I had to do. The house needed to burn. Everything needed to be destroyed. Mrs. Elston, the spirits of the children, the twisted hold they had over Susan. It all had to end. I gathered what I could find. Gasoline, matches, anything that would set the fire in motion. The house would burn to the ground, and with it, everything that had been tied to it. But there was one thing I couldn't escape. I couldn't burn it all without confronting Mrs. Elston. I didn't want to go back to her house, but I had no choice. If I was going to free Susan, if I was going to free the children, I had to face the woman who had kept them bound for so long. I needed to destroy her hold on Susan, and I needed to make sure she could never hurt anyone again. I found her sitting on the porch once more, her wrinkled hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at me as I approached, but I could feel her gaze, heavy and cold, bearing down on me. She knew what I was planning, and she wasn't afraid. She never had been. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice so calm it was almost a whisper. "You can't destroy what's already dead." I'm not trying to destroy the dead, I snapped, my voice tight with fury. I'm trying to free them. She let out a soft chuckle, the sound brittle and hollow. Free them? They don't want to be free, James. They want to stay with me. They're just children, after all. They're not children anymore, Mrs. Elston, I said, stepping closer, my heart pounding in my chest. They're ghosts, and I'm not going to let you use them to trap my wife. I'm not going to let you trap anyone else. Her eyes flickered to me then, and for the first time I saw something dark, something terrifying behind them. You think you can take her away from me, she hissed. You think you can undo what I've done. I will, I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. I'll burn this house down, and I'll make sure you never touch anyone again. She smiled then, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was cruel, filled with centuries of regret and malice. You don't understand. I never wanted them to die. I only wanted them to stay with me. But now they are part of me, and I am part of them. You cannot separate us. Before I could respond, the air in the yard shifted. A chill swept through the air, and I felt something. No, someone touched my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty yard, the shadows stretching long in the early morning light. But then I heard it, soft like the rustle of a whisper, but growing louder. The sound of children's laughter, not joyful, but hollow, empty. And then I saw them, the children. Pale, their eyes wide and unblinking, their faces twisted in a mix of fear and hunger. They were all around me in the yard, standing on the edges of the house, watching me with blank, lifeless stares. They were the spirits Mrs. Elston had kept trapped all these years, their souls bound to the house, bound to her. I could feel their pull, their longing, their desperate need to be free. And in that moment, I understood what had to be done. I wasn't just fighting Mrs. Elston. I was fighting the house itself, the land, the very memories of the children that had died there. It was more than just one woman. It was a curse that needed to be broken. I reached for the gasoline, the match in my hand shaking, my heart racing. The children's laughter grew louder, and I could feel their cold breath on my skin. Mrs. Elston wasn't just a woman anymore. She was part of them. She was their keeper, their mother, and their tormentor. I lit the match, the flame flickering as it touched the gasoline-soaked wood. The fire started slow, but it didn't take long for it to spread, devouring the house with a hunger that matched the children's. Mrs. Elston's eyes widened as the flames reached her porch. She reached out, her hands trembling, but it was too late. No, she screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of the fire. I didn't look back as I ran toward the house, pushing past the children's spirits, feeling their icy fingers brush my skin. I didn't care anymore. The house was burning, and with it, Mrs. Elston's twisted legacy. When I reached Susan, I found her standing at the edge of the yard, her eyes blank, her body stiff. But I could see the faintest glimmer of recognition in her eyes, something that had been lost for so long. Susan, I said, my voice breaking, it's time to go. She didn't answer, but I took her hand, pulling her away from the fire, away from the house that had once held us captive. The spirits of the children wailed, their cries mixing with the sound of the flames, but I didn't stop. We had to leave. The house was nothing but ashes by the time we made it to the end of the street. The fire had consumed everything. Every room, every secret, every part of that house where Mrs. Elston had kept the children's spirits bound. The air still reeked of smoke, thick and acrid, and the wind carried with it the faintest whispers, echoes of the lives that had been lost there. Susan's hand was cold in mine, but she was with me. I could feel her presence, even though she hadn't said a word since I'd pulled her away from the fire. She was still distant, her eyes unfocused, as if something was holding her just beyond reach. I kept walking, pulling her with me, not sure what to say, not sure if there was anything I could say. We didn't speak for hours. We just walked, the town behind us growing quieter as we moved farther away from it. I wasn't sure where we were going, but I knew we couldn't go back. Not now. Not after what had happened. That night, we found a motel on the outskirts of town. The room was small, barely enough to fit the bed and the dresser, but it was enough. Susan didn't even react when I helped her inside. She didn't even seem to notice the cramped space, the dingy carpet, the flickering fluorescent lights. It was like she was trapped in some distant place, a place far away from everything that had happened. I sat beside her on the bed, staring at her, willing her to look at me, to say something, anything. But she didn't. It was as though her mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't follow. I didn't know what to do. I had saved her, I had freed her from that woman's grasp, but I hadn't saved her from the damage that had already been done. The days that followed were a blur. We moved from town to town, never staying in one place too long. Susan didn't speak, but I could feel her presence like a shadow trailing me wherever I went. I tried to keep the conversation going, tried to keep things normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. I knew that what we had experienced would stay with us forever. That house, Mrs. Elston, the spirits of the children, they would haunt us for the rest of our lives. I couldn't help but wonder how many others had suffered the same fate. How many had moved into that house, only to fall victim to Mrs. Elston's twisted obsession. The thought made me sick to my stomach. I had tried to save Susan, but I couldn't erase the memories. I couldn't take back what had happened. One evening, a few weeks after the fire, we sat in a diner in a town we didn't know. The booth was small, the air thick with the smell of grease and coffee. Susan sat across from me, staring out the window, her hands folded in her lap. She was still silent, but she seemed to be looking at something far away. I knew she was thinking about it. The house, Mrs. Elston, the children. I could feel it, even though she didn't say a word. I didn't know if Susan would ever fully recover. I didn't know if I would. But I did know one thing. The nightmare was over. Mrs. Elston was gone, the house was gone, and the children had finally been freed from their endless torment. The waitress came by with our coffee, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something resembling peace settle over me. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was ours to walk. And as I looked across the table at Susan, I knew that as long as we had each other, we could survive anything. The story of my upstairs neighbors from hell. I have to tell the story of my upstairs neighbors from hell. I recently moved into my dream apartment. I knew it was everything I had ever wanted in a flat the moment I walked in the door at the viewing. It was not too expensive, so I put in an offer. After a few nail-biting days, I received the phone call. The place was mine. I was warned that the place was not very quiet, but I have never been a light sleeper, so that did not deter me at all. I was overjoyed at the prospect of living in my dream home. I packed up my whole life into boxes. I went to IKEA to pick out furniture. No less than 3 trips to be accurate. I spent way too much money, especially on things I did not really need, things that just added that little extra to the place. I was in love with that flat, and people do crazy things when they are in love. That first night, after the movers brought my furniture and IKEA had dropped off all my new stuff, I just sat on the couch and took in the fruits of my labor. I had never been happier with a flat in my life. And after years of weird flatmates and other people's hair in my shower, I felt like I deserved this. My own little palace. And then it started. The upstairs neighbors. Just them walking around sounded like a herd of wildebeest fleeing a lion. I knew a couple lived there. It baffled me how it was possible for 2 people to make that much noise. It bothered me to be sure, but I was not too worried. Like I said, I am not a light sleeper, and they had to go to bed at some point too, right? Wrong. After a few weeks in that place, it became painfully obvious that these people never slept. Not only did they never sleep, they would spend every night rearranging furniture or something. I would lay awake in bed, trying to picture what they could possibly be doing to be making so much noise. It sounded like there were more than just 2 people up there. It sounded like there was a whole battalion of little drummer boys. And then the yelling started. I guess they were not getting along very well. If they were speaking a language I understood, I bet you I would have been able to hear every single insult they hurled at each other. The tone they used needed no translation. It sounded like they were going to rip each other's heads off any minute. A part of me wished they would, so I would have some peace and quiet. I started sleeping with earplugs, but then there were the thuds. A few times a week, around 2 a.m., something heavy would drop on the floor upstairs. I could have sworn it made my whole bed shake. It would certainly wake me up. I would lay awake in bed, throwing curses at the ceiling. Like that would help. I could lay there for hours, listening to someone trying to quietly walk around up there. Why bother? I would yell in my head. You already woke up the whole house with your thudding. Other nights, there would be more yelling, door slamming, and I would hear heavy boots stomp down the stairs. Hours later, heavy boots would stomp back up the stairs and then get into bed. Occasionally, there would be loud music. Eurotrash with a heavy bass. There would be more yelling, but the happy kind. I would hear heavy boot stomping that could be dancing and such. It was pretty clear that these people were drinkers, possibly of the barely functioning alcoholic type. That was the picture I was creating in my mind, at least. And don't even get me started about the sex. Or actually get me started about the sex. I have always suspected that some people have to sound like adult stars in bed. Why else would adult stars sound that way? But I had never heard it live before. But this couple, oh man, they sounded like scores of monkeys screeching in unison. And then it was their bed. I would have sworn they had placed it against the wall on purpose, just for maximum sound effects. I started wondering whether the wall would collapse from the repeated trauma. Maybe they would take down the whole building one night. I might be a little bit bitter due to my own sexless existence, but that was not normal sex. That was crazy demon sex, I'm telling you. Well, to be quite honest, I might be embellishing a little bit here, but still. There was just so much noise. From the first day, I knew deep down that I had to do something eventually. My perfect apartment was turning into my perfect hell. I dreaded going home. I dreaded trying to sleep. Now, I am very conflict shy and non-confrontational, so during the day I would manage to convince myself that it was all fine, and that I did not really need to intervene. It worked for a while. As we all know, denial can only take you so far, and eventually I came to hate these people more than I have ever hated anyone. I never even met them. I just knew I hated them. I mean, I did not really hate them. I just hated them like you hate that one annoying guy in class, or you hate the guy who listens to music on his shitty speakers on the bus, or the guy who cuts in line at the store. Finally, I realized I could not live like this anymore. I needed to overcome my fears, face my demons, and deal with the situation. It took me a while to come up with a good plan. I mean, I did not want to antagonize them. If they came to think of me as the crazy, annoying downstairs neighbor, they would never be quiet. I needed to be charming, disarming, and very, very nice. Finally, I came up with a perfect plan. Let's just say it involved a reasonably priced bottle of whiskey and a friendly, neighborly smile. It took me a while to work up the nerve, but finally I did it. I faced my fears, I went up there and dealt with the problem. It really did get a lot better. A few days ago, the police came to my door. Asked me if I knew anything about the upstairs neighbors. I told them the truth. I knew next to nothing about them. They asked me if there had been any suspicious activity in the building recently. No again, why? Had I heard anything strange lately? Strange? Like what? No, nothing strange. Well, hun, it seems that your upstairs neighbors had some serious relationship problems. I heard some completely new noises coming from upstairs, and then I heard 2 pairs of heavy boots coming down the stairs. Suddenly, a stretcher with a body bag came into my view. I gasped loudly. Wait, did something happen to them? I asked, the shock clearly visible on my face. It's been quiet up there lately. I thought they were on a vacation or something. I'm so sorry you had to see that, hun. He tried reassuringly. We're not quite sure what happened yet. Nothing for you to worry your pretty little head about. It looks pretty cut and dry. We're thinking they got drunk, got into a fight, you know. It seems he took her out, then ended himself. He sighed. It's always the boyfriend in these cases, you know. Always the boyfriend. He added, shaking his head. My eyes widened in fear. They're both dead. But what? How? I don't understand. I'm afraid I've already disclosed too many details about the case. He sighed, but I don't want you to be scared. It was obviously a domestic issue. I know it's a bit gruesome, but it's not like there's a serial killer on the loose or something. As long as you don't believe in ghosts, it's nothing to be afraid of here, he laughed. I didn't. And that is the last I heard of the upstairs neighbors from hell. So why am I writing this story? Well, I guess I just want someone to know. They say it's always the boyfriend. Except sometimes it isn't. And frankly, when I saw those 2 stretchers getting carried down the stairs, when I carefully contorted my face into a mask of worry, when the police questioned me about any suspicious activity in the building, when the death was ruled murder, when the case was closed, I realized getting away with murder felt good. I might just do this again. I took the job because I needed the money. After 4 years of scraping by in college, I was drowning in student loans and had no real career prospects. The ad was straightforward. Live-in caretaker needed for elderly woman. Room, board, and competitive pay provided. I figured it was an easy gig. Keep an old woman company, maybe cook a few meals, and have time to figure out my life. The mansion, Whitford House, stood alone at the edge of town, past a stretch of forest that swallowed the road. The taxi driver who dropped me off wouldn't even go up the driveway, muttering something about bad history before speeding off. The place looked like something from another century. Tall, cold, and lifeless. The wraparound porch sagged slightly, and the windows were so dark I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. It wasn't abandoned, but it felt forgotten. Mrs. Evelyn Whitford was waiting for me in the parlor when I stepped in. She was small and brittle, wrapped in a thick shawl despite the summer heat. Her eyes followed me like she was memorizing my face. She didn't say much, just nodded when I introduced myself and gestured for me to sit. Then there was Gregory, the butler. He wasn't what I expected. He wasn't an old man in a suit. He was tall, gaunt, and unnervingly quiet, maybe in his late 50s, though something about him felt older. He barely acknowledged me as he led me through the house, pointing out my room, the kitchen, and Mrs. Whitford's quarters. He moved without sound, his shoes never making a single creak on the old wooden floors. That first night, I heard something in the attic. It wasn't mice. It wasn't the house settling. It was whispers. And Gregory was standing in the hallway, watching my door. The second day at Whitford House was worse. Mrs. Whitford barely acknowledged me. She sat in her chair by the window, hands folded in her lap, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the trees. I tried to engage her, offered to read to her, asked if she needed anything. But all she did was shake her head slowly. Gregory, on the other hand, was everywhere. I'd turn a corner, and he'd be standing there. I'd enter a room, and he'd already be inside. He didn't say much beyond a few polite nods and uncomfortably direct stares. I started noticing small things. My belongings weren't where I left them. The bathroom door, which I swore I had closed, would be open when I returned. A draft of cold air slipped through the hallways even though the windows were shut tight. And then there was the attic door. It was the only door in the house that was locked. The handle was old brass, scratched and worn, with deep grooves in the wood beneath it, like someone had clawed at it. I asked Gregory about it at dinner. "What's in the attic?" I said, stabbing at my overcooked meat. He didn't even look up. "Storage." "Can I go up there?" "No." Silence stretched between us. Mrs. Whitford, who had barely touched her food, slowly turned her head toward me. Her pale lips twitched, and for the first time she spoke. "Do not go into the attic, Miss Hart, ever." Her voice was so weak I barely heard it, but there was something in it. Fear. I nodded, but my curiosity was already burning. That night, I lay awake, listening. At 2:47 a.m., the noises started. Faint at first. The scrape of something heavy moving above me. Then whispers, the same as before, growing louder like several voices speaking at once. I sat up, my breath shallow. The air in my room felt dense, pressing down on my chest. Then, just outside my door, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I gripped my blanket, heart hammering. The footsteps stopped. I knew someone was standing just beyond the wood, listening. I waited. The door never opened. But in the silence, I heard something worse. A quiet chuckle. And then the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of Whitford House shifting in the night. The whispers had stopped, but the memory of them lingered. Too many voices speaking at once. By morning, I had made a decision. I was going to find out what was in that attic. After breakfast, I started searching the house. Mrs. Whitford stayed in her chair by the window, and Gregory disappeared into whatever dark corner he lurked in during the day. That left me alone to explore. The mansion was old, but it had been beautiful once. Dusty chandeliers hung from high, carved ceilings. The library shelves stretched floor to ceiling, packed with books whose leather bindings had rotted away. Most of the furniture was covered with white sheets, like ghosts frozen in place. I checked the parlor, the study, even the basement, searching for a key to the attic. Nothing. Then I thought of Gregory. Where does he keep his keys? The answer came that afternoon when I caught him leaving the dining hall. A ring of brass and iron keys hung from his belt, tucked beneath his jacket. I needed those keys. I waited until evening. That night, I set my alarm for 1:30 a.m. The house was silent when I slipped out of my room. I moved carefully, barefoot to avoid making noise. Gregory's room was down the hall from mine. The door was slightly ajar. Careless, I took a deep breath and crept inside. His room was small. Too small for a man who had lived here his whole life. Just a simple bed, a wooden wardrobe, and a nightstand. No personal items, no pictures. But on the nightstand, sitting beside a single unlit candle, was the keyring. I grabbed it. Then I heard breathing. I froze. Gregory was asleep, lying rigid on his bed, his face turned toward the ceiling. His chest barely moved. He looked dead. I backed away. I made it to the door, my pulse hammering, when Gregory's voice, low, calm, and cold, stopped me. That door is locked for a reason, Miss Hart. I turned. He hadn't moved. His eyes were still closed, but he was smiling. I ran. Heart pounding, I sprinted down the hall, clutching the keys so tight they cut into my palm. I reached the attic door, shoved a key into the lock, and turned. The click echoed down the hallway. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Damp wood, rotting fabric, something sour and decayed. The attic was massive, stretching the entire length of the house. Moonlight filtered through a single round window, casting long shadows over old furniture, trunks, and something else. A row of iron cages. Each one lined the far wall, doors rusted shut. Inside, I saw piles of old clothes, bones half buried beneath dust, deep scratches gouged into the floorboards. I staggered back. That's when I saw it. A figure, slumped in the corner, barely breathing. A man. His skin was gray, his clothes shredded. His eyes fluttered open. Sunken hollow. He tried to speak, but his voice came out a dry, cracked whisper. Run. Behind me, the attic door slammed shut. And then I heard Gregory's footsteps. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The attic door was closed, but I hadn't touched it. Gregory's footsteps echoed on the stairs, slow and deliberate, like a judge approaching the gallows. I had seconds to move. I darted behind an old wardrobe, pressing myself into the shadows. My pulse pounded in my ears as I heard the creak of the attic door opening again. Gregory stepped inside. Miss Hart, his voice was calm, patient. You should not be here. I held my breath. The man in the corner, the prisoner, let out a ragged breath. His eyes, dull and sunken, flickered toward me. He tried to speak again, but only a dry rasp came out. Gregory took a step further inside. I have been very lenient, he continued, tone smooth. Too smooth. The others, they did not get this chance. Others. The words sent a chill down my spine. The prisoner managed one word, hoarse and broken. Run. I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I whispered, Who are you? His breathing hitched. His throat worked like it hurt to form words, but after a long, painful moment, he spoke. William Cross. A shudder ran through him. I was the last one. A sharp intake of breath rattled in my chest. Last, caretaker, I guessed. He gave a weak nod. Before you. Gregory sighed. It is disappointing when they start to talk. I risked another glance at the cages. 6 in total. The iron was warped, rusted with age. Deep scratch marks lined the bars. Not from an animal, from people. This had been happening for years. Decades. You are wondering, I assume, why you are here, Gregory continued. He sounded amused. They all do. I clenched my fists. You kill them, I said. Not a question. Gregory chuckled softly. Not quite, he said. You misunderstand, Miss Hart. I do not kill them. The house does. Something deep inside me twisted. William tried to speak again, but his body sagged, too weak to keep going. Gregory sighed. It is tradition, he went on. A pact made long before my time. The Whitford bloodline. We built this house. It protects us. But it requires something in return. I swallowed hard. People. Not just any people, he corrected. Servants. Caretakers. Those who come here to serve. They are absorbed, and I remain. I stepped back. You're feeding off them. Gregory's face didn't change. It is not so crude. It is simply the way of things. I live, and they become part of the house. I barely held back a shudder. Why me? I whispered. Gregory tilted his head. Because you were foolish enough to come, he said simply. Something shifted in the attic. A deep, creaking groan. The house was moving. Gregory turned his eyes toward the ceiling. "Ah," he murmured. "It knows you now." I realized in that moment that the Whitford house was alive. My fingers tightened around the keys. There had to be a way out. William's breath came shallow. If I left him here, he would die. I could still hear the whispers, the voices of the others before me. Their bones were still in the cages. I wasn't going to join them. I took a deep breath. Then, before Gregory could react, I ran for the door. He moved fast. Too fast. But I was faster. I slammed it behind me and turned the key in the lock. Gregory pounded against the door, his voice eerily calm on the other side. "You cannot escape, Miss Hart." But I was already racing down the stairs. I didn't have time. I needed to find a way to kill him, and fast. I hit the bottom of the attic stairs at full speed, nearly losing my footing as I sprinted down the hall. The house groaned. The walls felt closer, tighter, like they were breathing. Gregory was still upstairs, but he wouldn't stay locked up forever. I had minutes, maybe less. Mrs. Whitford's door was slightly ajar, and for the first time since I arrived, I saw something in her eyes. Not the usual blank stare, but fear. "You knew," I said, stepping inside, my voice shaking. She didn't deny it. Her lips moved soundlessly, her frail hands gripping the blankets in her lap. She shook her head, not at me, but at something behind me. I turned. The hallway lights flickered. The attic door was open. Gregory was free. "You should not have run, Miss Hart," Gregory called down the stairs. His footsteps were slow, measured. He was enjoying this. I turned back to Mrs. Whitford, desperate. "How do I stop him?" I pleaded. "There has to be a way." Her eyes flickered toward the fireplace. The Whitford journals. I lunged for the books, shoving them open with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with old rituals, incantations, strange symbols. But one word stood out in jagged, inked scrawl. "Bound to the house." I scanned the page, breath catching in my throat. He wasn't just bound to the house. He was part of it. I looked at the fireplace, then at the massive wooden beams supporting the house. If I couldn't kill him, maybe I could destroy the house. A sharp crack above made me flinch. Gregory was on the landing now, his dark silhouette looming over the railing. "You cannot win, Miss Hart," he said. I shoved the journal into my coat and ran. The hallway seemed longer. The house was shifting, stretching. The doors disappeared as I passed them. The stairs groaned under my feet like they were about to give way. But I didn't stop. I ran for the basement. If the house was alive, I needed to kill it at the root. The basement door slammed shut behind me as I stumbled inside, gasping for air. It was cold, colder than it should have been. Candles lined the stone walls, their flames flickering wildly as if caught in an unseen wind. I barely noticed them, because in the center of the room was an altar, a ritual site. This was where it had started. I flipped open the journal, scanning for anything that looked like a reversal. My hands were shaking too badly to focus. Footsteps. Gregory was coming. I yanked down a shelf of old glass bottles, sending them shattering against the stone. A thick black liquid oozed out, coating the floor. It smelled rotten, ancient. The air rippled around me. The house was waking up. Gregory stepped into the doorway. His dark eyes gleamed. "That book will not save you." I held it tighter. "You're bound to the house," I said. "If I destroy it." He smiled. "A bold idea," he said, voice like silk. "But you do not have the means." I took a step back. He was right. I couldn't just burn a house this size, but I could do something else. I grabbed one of the candles and threw it onto the black liquid. Flames erupted across the floor, climbing up the walls like living things. Gregory's smile finally faltered. The house screamed. The wooden beams groaned. The ceiling above us split. Gregory's expression darkened. He took a step forward, but for the first time, he hesitated. The fire wasn't just burning the house. It was burning him. "Miss Hart," he said, voice less certain, "you do not understand what you are doing." I grabbed a rusted iron rod from the floor and lunged. Gregory raised a hand to block me, but he was slower now. The flames were draining him, just like they had sustained him for years. I drove the iron straight through his chest. His body convulsed. For the first time since I'd met him, his expression changed. Not calm, not composed, but afraid. The walls trembled. Gregory screamed, and the house began to fall. The floor lurched beneath me as the fire consumed the basement, thick smoke curling up the crumbling walls. Gregory's body convulsed against the iron rod, his skin cracking like aged porcelain. The house was rejecting him. I stumbled back, coughing, my lungs burning as flames clawed toward the ceiling beams. Above me, I could hear the groans of the collapsing mansion. Gregory's dark eyes locked onto mine, his face frozen in something I could only describe as realization. Not anger, not malice, but the cold, hollow understanding that his time was finally up. A deep crack split the stone foundation, and the entire room lurched sideways. I had no choice but to run, vaulting over a fallen beam as the fire followed me, licking at my heels. Behind me, Gregory let out a single inhuman shriek, a sound that didn't belong in this world. Then the fire swallowed him whole. I barely made it to the stairs. The heat pressed against my back as I threw my weight against the basement door, stumbling into the main hall. The house was coming apart. The walls buckled, groaning like a dying beast. Chandeliers crashed from the ceiling. The paintings of the long-dead Whitfords blistered and peeled away as if their souls were finally escaping. I ran past the dining room, where Mrs. Whitford still sat, her frail form motionless. For a moment, I thought she was already dead. But then she smiled. The flames reflected in her glassy eyes, and her lips parted slightly, mouthing words I couldn't hear over the roaring fire. Then she closed her eyes. I didn't have time to think about what it meant. I ran. The front doors wouldn't budge. Of course they wouldn't. I grabbed a chair, hurling it at the nearest window. Glass shattered, and a blast of cold night air rushed inside, mixing with the suffocating heat. I climbed onto the ledge and jumped. My body hit the overgrown lawn hard, rolling across damp grass. I barely had time to register the impact before a deep, thunderous groan rattled the ground. I looked up just in time to see Whitford House collapse in on itself. The roof caved first, then the second floor, then the first. Like a dying animal curling into itself, the house imploded, dragging all its secrets, all its horrors, and whatever was left of Gregory down into the earth. A final gust of heat and ash blasted past me. Then silence. I sat up slowly, my body aching, my hands trembling. The house was gone. Nothing but embers remained, glowing faintly in the night. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the smoldering ruins, half expecting something. Anything. To crawl from the wreckage. But nothing did. It was over. Then I heard it. A whisper. So faint, I almost thought I imagined it. Miss Hart. My blood ran cold. I turned, heart hammering. There was nothing behind me. Just the ruins of Whitford House, crumbling into the night. But I knew that voice. I would always know that voice. Gregory. Even in death, he wasn't finished. The fire department arrived at dawn. They had a lot of questions. I had no answers. The official report said the fire started from old, faulty wiring. An accident. They found no human remains in the rubble. No sign of Mrs. Whitford. No sign of Gregory. I left town the next day. 1. At first, I didn't think anything of it. My neighbor would stop to chat with me, leash in hand, and I would catch glimpses of the metal slider dangling from its belly. I assumed it was wearing a piece of pet clothing, or that perhaps it was the byproduct of some awkward veterinarian procedure. But the more we chatted and the more I saw this mystery zipper, the more I realized it was out of the ordinary, clearly embedded in the dog's skin. It drew my attention every time we engaged in small talk, until finally one day, I decided to ask about it. Say, what is that zipper for on the little guy's belly anyway? Oh, that. It's a long story. I wouldn't want to bore you. I've got nothing but time. I wondered if she could see the beads of sweat forming above my brow. Really, it's nothing, just a safety measure. And that was it. She pretty much laughed it off, granting me little in the way of an explanation. Thinking back, her responses were downright vague and deflective. She could see how curious I was, so why not just tell me? And what exactly did she mean by safety measure? As unfruitful as our conversation was, I didn't press the matter any further. Days, weeks, months went by. I would occasionally see the dog's strange cosmetic feature, but I brushed it off every time, knowing it would only haunt me if I dwelled on it. Still, the thought itched in the back of my mind. It wasn't until a few months had passed that I would finally have the nerve to scratch it. I was pulling up weeds along my fence when I looked over at my neighbor's place, noticing the dog lying on the back porch. A stray cat wandered by, as often happened in our neighborhood. Without so much as a warning growl or malicious stance, the dog trotted over to the cat and scarfed it down, the sound of sharp teeth colliding with bone. The cat screeched in agony until it was no more. In a minute flat, its entire body was devoured. I was in shock. The cat's cries alerted my neighbor to the situation. She raced outside, grabbed the dog by the collar, and pulled him into the house. Through the sliding door, it was tough to make out, but I swear she unzipped him and reached inside, seemingly adjusting one of his organs. He didn't flinch, not even a bit. After pulling her arm out, the dog dropped to the floor, dead as a doornail from the looks of it. She then carried him outside and placed him back on the porch, arranging him into a sleeping position before getting in her car and leaving for the day. This 5-minute span of visual information was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Words like gruesome, strange, and horrific are too tame to describe what I saw. I was appalled beyond measure. After the shock wore off, I hopped the fence and approached the dog's carcass. I felt its neck, cold to the touch, no pulse. I looked to its underside, and there it was. That God-forsaken zipper in all of its mysterious glory. I felt kind of bad for the dog dying, but I had to know what that thing was there for. I needed an explanation for not only the dog's, but my neighbor's odd behavior just moments ago. I slowly unzipped the dog's belly, placating my curiosity with the satisfying sound of metal sliding across metal. I spread each side of the opening with my hands and peered in, divulging the animal's inner workings. What I saw was absolutely dumbfounding. My neighbor's dog was animatronic. I decided that my best course of action would be to call animal control. I could tell them my neighbor's dog trespassed on my lawn and was attacking the neighborhood cats. They would show up, examine the robotic carcass, and then go from there. I knew there wasn't a protocol for that sort of thing, but I assumed they could take care of things and contact the appropriate people, whether it be the police, the government, or the National Enquirer. As long as this weird predicament was taken care of, I could sleep easy, knowing that my neighbor's strange robot dog wasn't going around eating whatever it pleased. Simple, right? Nope. Far from it. Animal control took a while to get there. By the time they arrived, my neighbor had come home and disposed of the evidence, hiding the dog somewhere in her home. The animal control officer apologized for the misunderstanding and left, leaving my neighbor on her front porch, glaring in my direction. It appeared privacy meant nothing to the local authorities, just my luck. The days that followed were different. My neighbor's dog had sprung to life, reactivated by its master, no doubt. They would walk their usual path around the cul-de-sac, but would not stop for small talk. I knew her dirty little secret after all. I was no longer a friendly neighbor to be conversed with. Oh no, I was an enemy, a danger to this woman's unusual way of life. Even if I meant no harm to her or her strange choice of pet, she didn't seem to see it that way. She continued to give me the cold shoulder for about a month and a half before finally speaking with me again on one of her daily strolls. Hey there. Hello. Everything all right? Just peaky. I'm having a cookout on Saturday at noon. You're more than welcome to come. Strange. We weren't on speaking terms for over a month, and now I was suddenly invited over. Maybe this was her extending an olive branch my way, her way of saying, no hard feelings. Yeah, sure. I can make it. Sounds like a good time. Great. I'll add you to the list. As she walked away, I felt the need to apologize, even if her dog was a weird, cat-eating robot. Hey, about that animal control call, I just wanted to say, don't worry about it. Water under the bridge. See you Saturday. She hurried off home, and that was that. Problem solved. Or so I thought. The night before the cookout, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps creeping around the perimeter of my house. Every time I got up to investigate, the sound ceased and the coast appeared to be clear. It was either a prank at my expense, a burglar taking their sweet time to pull the trigger, or ghosts roaming around in the night. Either way, it left me anxious, making sleep a distant dream, just out of my reach. During a particularly loud set of footsteps, I raced downstairs, just in time to catch 4 glowing dots peering in through my living room window. This was enough to make my neck hairs stand upright. Though terrified, I wasted no time grabbing a ball bat and storming out my front door to greet the would-be intruders. I may be old, but I can still kick some ass when needed, especially when it involves crossing my property line. To my astonishment, my yard was empty. I covered every side of the house, only to find no one, not a soul in sight in any direction I looked. I don't care how fast you can sprint. Nobody could have made it out of eyeshot in such a short period of time, even in those low light conditions. Baffled and even more anxious than before, I locked up every last door and window in my home before crawling under the covers like a frightened child, scared of the mystery figures lurking in the shadows. The footsteps dissipated over the course of the night, and as the sun came up over the horizon, so too did my fear. My waking nightmare had ended, but not before putting a weary, sleep-deprived frame of mind in its place. In a sluggish slur of movement, I grudgingly made my way to my neighbor's house around noon, ready as I would ever be for the neighborhood get-together. Oddly enough, there were no cars in the driveway, aside from her own. I wondered if I got the date wrong, but after knocking on the door, she greeted me with a smile and rushed me into the house. We exchanged pleasantries, and she sat me down at a bar stool in the kitchen. After a few moments of awkward silence, I mustered up the courage to ask about the elephant in the room. "So, where is everybody?" "You're already here, silly." I tilted my head, puzzled. "What about everyone else?" "There is no one else. You're the only person I invited." All at once, the pieces clicked into place. I felt stupid for not realizing it sooner. Her sudden kindness, the noises the night before. There was no cookout. There was never any cookout. I was in the middle of a trap, lured in largely due to my own idiocy. I should have guessed that something sinister was going on the moment I unzipped that dog. "So, what happens now?" I asked. "You'll see. Just sit tight." I quickly jumped up from my chair and turned towards the door. With inhuman speed, she bolted in front of me, a large kitchen knife in hand. Not so fast. I stood, still as stone, intimidated by her fluid motions and firm stance. "We need to talk." "About what?" I knew exactly what. Don't play dumb with me. And that's when I noticed it. On her chest, peeking through the top of her blouse. I would have missed it had the sunlight coming through the window not danced across its metal. She had a zipper too. The next few moments are a bit fuzzy, but I can only guess that I was knocked out or chloroformed as I awoke strapped to a chair in a new room. Given the staircase, I assumed I was in her basement, though this realization didn't help me any. I attempted to break free of my restraints, but it was no use. Unless she were to free me herself, I was fastened to that chair for life. In absence of mobility, I decided to give the place a once-over. The staircase was to my left and a concrete wall to my right, but directly in front of me was a workstation, complete with about a dozen computers. This is where my neighbor sat, a USB cord snaking out of her unzipped chest, typing away at a blinding rate. Her motives were still unclear to me. Though confined to the one view, I was able to turn my neck enough in both directions to form a decent picture of what was behind me. It was a wall of cages, each housing an identical copy of her dog. They didn't move, even in the slightest, likely just as animatronic as she was. What on God's green earth had I stumbled into? Just then, my neighbor ripped the cord from her chest and walked over to me. "Ah, good. You're awake. Did you have a nice nap?" I refused to reply, looking her up and down in disgust, trying to make out what this thing was that was speaking to me. "What's the matter? Dog got your tongue?" I remained silent, in lieu of her taunting me. "That's all right. You just need to listen. Sit tight. I'll be right back." She walked over to her workstation and grabbed something before reclaiming her spot in front of me. "I've worked too hard in this location to have you screwing things up on me. Then again, it's my own fault. I was careless. I never should have left my core on the porch like that." I assumed she was talking about the dog. "I want you to look at this." She placed the object at eye level. It was a badge of sorts, upon which was a logo that read Syntheti Tech. "I'm an android. I work for a large company, moving from location to location, gathering specific information that is crucial to our initiative. You can't know anything beyond that. Hell, you already know far too much." I hadn't noticed it at first, but she seemed to keep playing with her zipper. God, I am so sick of this meat suit. Before my very eyes, she removed her clothing and unzipped herself down to the groin. In the most unnatural way possible, she slid out of her own skin, revealing to me her true form. She was nothing but a pile of electronics, pieced together in human shape. It was a strange sight, nauseating in every sense of the word. The way she moved and spoke while like this was downright sickening. I can't say any more, but I want you to know that our work is necessary. If you were to speak these truths to the world above, you would be jeopardizing everything we've accomplished. You have to submit to our intentions and see that they are just. I didn't know what to make of this. I simply looked away, wishing not to see her grotesque animatronic face any longer. Unfortunately for me, she grabbed it and forced it in her direction anyway, the feeling of cold metal enveloping my jaw. You need to promise to me that you will submit. You are not to tell anyone of any of this. Do you understand? I nodded in agreement, but only because I wanted her hand off of my face. Luckily, she let go and backed away. Good. You know, we're not so bad when you get to know us. In a sense, we're just like you. Internally, I scoffed at the thought of this. I was nothing like her, and not just because of her appearance. I was never one to go around kidnapping my neighbors, holding them captive in my basement. It just wasn't my cup of tea. Well, this is it. I'll need you to take over from here. Don't make the same mistake I did, lest you regret it for the rest of your life. This was the last thing she said to me, though I had no idea what any of it meant. I must have been knocked unconscious again, because the next thing I remember was waking up on her basement floor, no longer bound by my restraints. For one reason or another, she didn't kill me. I was a free man. Without warning, a group of trained operatives burst through the basement door and raced down to help me up. Are you all right? Yes, I'm fine. What's going on? I noticed a few of the men walk on opposite sides of the room to gather evidence. One guy ripped open a cage, grabbed one of the dogs, and unzipped him, revealing it to be nothing but a hollow carcass. They're empty, sir. A collection of shells. Just as I suspected. No matter. Load them into the truck with the hard drives. Hopefully she didn't wipe them before she left. I must have looked completely bewildered, because the gentleman grabbed me by the shoulders and looked me straight in the eye. Everything's fine now. We've been on this woman's tail for a long time. We may not have captured her, but this is still a big win, and it's all thanks to you. I was still confused, but more so relieved that it was all over. Are you sure you're all right? Don't need a ride to the hospital. I shook my head, not wishing to be poked and prodded after what I'd endured. I didn't trust doctors much anyway. I just wanted to go home. Okay, let me walk you to your house. I agreed, and we were off. I couldn't wait to get inside and put the whole ordeal behind me. That was the plan anyway. Whatever government officials they were, the entire crew picked the place clean and left my neighborhood within a couple of hours. That night I received a call from them for a statement regarding the situation. I obliged and asked some questions myself. Though the information was privileged, I guilted them into giving up some details, claiming I needed some peace of mind so I could sleep at night. The fact that I was just a frail old man helped too. It would seem my neighbor was a high-ranking disciple in an android cult hell-bent on infiltrating various government agencies. They were currently in the process of recruiting new members to aid in their cause. That's all I was told, which was more than I thought I'd get. This was enough to placate my curiosity and keep me from dwelling on the events as they unfolded. I thanked the man on the other end and hung up, content with my findings. After ending the call, I heard a knock at my front door. I didn't usually get visitors that late at night, but I suspected it would be one of my neighbors, asking about the sting operation that just took place next door. I opened the door, and to my surprise, there was no person there to greet me. No, not a person. Instead, there was a dog identical to my neighbor's. Before I could process its arrival, it trotted inside and sat on the floor. A voice then emanated from its collar. Shut the door. I did as the dog said, baffled and afraid. Hello, I am Serial 724234. I will be your core companion on your journey of fulfillment. True adventure awaits. Would you like to begin your first task? I didn't know how to respond or what in God's name was happening, but it was at this point that I felt an itch running up the length of my torso. It was subtle at first, but grew to the point that I had to reach down my shirt and scratch at it. That's when I felt a familiar metal caress my fingers. It took a moment for it to sink in, but I knew exactly what I was feeling. It was a zipper. We had always dreamed of leaving the city behind, finding a place that was ours. Away from the noise, the constant hustle, and the suffocating crowds. When Claire found the house, it seemed too perfect to be true. A crumbling old home on the edge of a quiet town, the kind of place that offered peace but hinted at something more. Claire, with her artist's eyes, saw beauty in every weathered corner, in the peeling paint and the overgrown vines that clung to the walls like some forgotten secret. I, on the other hand, was more practical, a history teacher who spent my days explaining the past to students who rarely paid attention. The history of this house, however, called to me. The first thing Claire did was walk straight to the garden, as if it were a piece of unfinished work waiting for her touch. She always had a way of seeing things differently, and there was something about the wildness of that place that fascinated her. I wasn't quite so enchanted. The garden seemed more chaotic than beautiful. Flowers that bloomed in odd patterns, vines that twisted unnaturally, ivy creeping up every surface. But I kept my thoughts to myself. She was happy, and in the end, that was all that mattered to me. The first few days passed without incident. We unpacked, settled in, and started to make the house our own. Claire spent most of her time in the garden, sketching, taking pictures, her enthusiasm growing with each passing hour. It was all she could talk about. She'd describe the strange flowers she'd found, or the way the light hit the garden at dusk, and I'd listen, nodding politely, unable to share her fascination. Still, I loved her enough to indulge her, and after all, I had my own work to focus on. Researching the house's history, something that seemed important to me, but I couldn't quite explain why. Then there was Mrs. Drake, the old woman who lived next door. We hadn't seen much of her at first, but it wasn't long before I felt her eyes on us. I'd catch her watching us from her porch, always at a distance, her gaze unsettling. It wasn't that she looked unfriendly. On the contrary, her expression was unreadable, as though she were trying to figure us out. Still, there was something about her presence that made me uneasy, like a memory of something forgotten. One afternoon, Claire was bent low, pulling weeds from the garden, when Mrs. Drake appeared at the fence, her voice sharp as it cut through the air. "That garden isn't yours to tend," she said, her words as abrupt as the crack of a branch underfoot. "Leave it be before it takes something from you." Claire didn't respond immediately, and I could see her raise an eyebrow, intrigued rather than alarmed. I had to admit, I was curious too. But Claire, always one to dismiss superstition, merely smiled. "We're just getting started," she called out. "Don't worry, Mrs. Drake, we'll take good care of it." Mrs. Drake didn't reply. She simply turned and walked away, her thin frame disappearing into the shadow of her house. That was the first time we'd heard the warning, but it wouldn't be the last. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice small changes in the garden. Nothing that Claire seemed to pick up on, of course. She was too engrossed, lost in her artwork and the mystery of the plants. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The vines grew faster than they should, twisting and knotting themselves in strange patterns overnight. Flowers that had bloomed in clusters one day were suddenly arranged in unnatural spirals, as if they were trying to communicate in some way I couldn't understand. The scent of the air, too, had changed, shifting from the pleasant floral notes I remembered to something heavier, earthier, almost pungent. Claire didn't seem concerned, though. In fact, the more time she spent in the garden, the more obsessed she became. I'd often find her out there at all hours of the day, sometimes long after the sun had set, her eyes wide, lost in whatever she was seeing. I tried to talk to her about it, but she would just smile and wave me off. "You're overthinking things," she'd say. "It's just a garden. It's beautiful, Ben. You should come out here more." I tried to make sense of it all. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I'd been buried in research, digging through the house's history, looking for clues. My curiosity about the land had turned into an obsession of my own. I discovered that the house had been built on land that had once been home to an old cemetery, one that had long since been forgotten, but the records were scarce and incomplete. There were rumors about missing persons from decades ago, whispers of people vanishing without a trace, and vague mentions of a secretive group. It was all speculation, really nothing concrete. But still, the more I read, the more I couldn't help but feel that the house, this land, was hiding something darker than just overgrown gardens and crumbling foundations. I didn't want to worry Claire. She was already so consumed by the garden, by whatever it was that had caught her attention. But one night, as I was coming back from town, I saw her standing at the edge of the garden, staring into the darkened maze of vines. It was well past midnight, and I couldn't understand why she hadn't come inside. "Claire," I called out, my voice breaking the silence. She didn't answer right away. When she finally turned to face me, her eyes looked distant, unfocused. Like she was seeing something beyond the garden, something I couldn't. "Ben," she whispered, her voice strained, as if she'd been holding something back. "I've been dreaming about it, about the garden. There's something alive in it, something that watches me." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the first time she'd said anything like that. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. She shook her head, her eyes flickering to the garden once more. "I can't explain it, but I need to go deeper. I need to understand it." I could feel the pull of her obsession, the same way I'd felt the pull of my own curiosity about the house's history. But this wasn't the same. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, that unsettling tightness that only grew with each passing day. The next day, I decided to take action. I went to town to ask around to see if anyone knew anything about the history of the garden, the land, or the house. It was time to get answers before Claire fell any further into the garden's grip. When I returned, I found Claire in the garden again, kneeling beside an old stone marker hidden in the overgrowth. She was digging with her bare hands, the dirt flying up around her like a whirlwind. Something in her expression, her frantic energy, told me that I was too late. I rushed over to her, pulling her away from the marker, but as I did, I saw what she had uncovered. A human skull. It was wrapped in thick, gnarled roots, and small flowers had grown inside the hollow sockets, giving the skull an eerie, almost unnatural look. Claire gasped as she reached for it, her fingers trembling. I don't know what this is," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and fascination. But I knew. I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't something we could just ignore. The garden had taken something, and it wasn't finished yet. I didn't know how to react to the skull. It felt like everything had shifted in that moment, like the ground beneath us had cracked open to reveal something far darker than we'd ever expected. Claire looked at me, her eyes wide, but there was no fear in them. Only a strange, almost morbid fascination. It was like she was drawn to the skull, to the roots that had wrapped around it, as if they were pulling her into the past. I grabbed her hand and pulled her away from it, my heart racing. "Claire, we need to get inside. Now." She didn't resist, but her gaze stayed fixed on the skull, as if it were calling to her. "It's just a bone, Ben," she said quietly, as if trying to convince herself. "Maybe it's from one of the old graves. You know, this land used to be a cemetery. This might be nothing." But I could tell she didn't believe it herself. There was something else in her voice, something I couldn't quite place. The air around us felt heavier, thicker, as though the very ground we stood on was alive in a way I couldn't understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning over the details in my mind. The skull, the strange flowers, the way the vines had seemed to pulse with life. And I couldn't shake the memory of Mrs. Drake's warning. "Leave it be before it takes something from you." Was it just a coincidence, or was she trying to tell us something? I knew I had to dig deeper. Claire was lost in the garden, and the more I saw of her obsession, the more I feared for her. So I went back to the old town records, hoping to find something I had missed. It wasn't long before I found an article buried in a dusty folder, a small mention of a series of disappearances in the town decades ago. The names were familiar, but it was the final sentence that caught my attention. They were last seen near the old cemetery, where rumors of a secretive cult had begun to resurface. A cult. The word sent a chill down my spine. I knew there had been stories, vague whispers about a group of people who had once lived in this area, but no one ever spoke of them in detail. The article mentioned nothing more, and when I tried to trace the names of the missing, I found nothing but more dead ends. But one thing was clear. The garden, the house, and the land had all been connected to something darker than just a few old graves. I tried to talk to Claire about it the next day, but she wouldn't listen. She was too far gone. "You're overthinking this, Ben," she said, her voice distant, like she was speaking from somewhere far away. "The garden is beautiful. It's a part of this house, a part of me." I couldn't get through to her. It was as if the garden had wrapped its roots around her, just as it had done with a skull. She couldn't see what I saw, and worse, she didn't want to. Mrs. Drake's warnings still echoed in my mind, but I had no way of knowing what to do. The more I looked into the house's history, the more I realized I had no idea what we were truly dealing with. Whatever had happened here in the past was far more sinister than a mere cult, and whatever had been buried beneath the soil was still alive. It had awakened, and it was hungry. I went back to the garden later that afternoon, hoping to find some kind of answer, something that would make sense of all this madness. But when I arrived, I found Claire kneeling by the stone marker again, her fingers tracing the dirt. She didn't notice me at first. When she finally looked up, her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Ben," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I saw something. Something in the garden. It was watching me." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Whatever it wasn't just a dream. The garden was alive, and it was aware of us. But how far would it go to keep us here? And what would it take before it took everything we had? The answer, I was beginning to understand, was everything. The days blurred together, and every passing hour felt like I was walking further into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Claire's obsession with the garden grew more intense with each day, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't reach her. She would wander into the maze of vines at all hours, her hands brushing against the leaves as if they were old friends, as if the garden were the only thing that understood her. I tried everything. I brought her tea, hoping it would break the spell. I suggested we take a walk, just the two of us, anywhere but the garden. But nothing worked. She had become consumed. The strange energy in the air seemed to pull her in, and I couldn't pull her out. One afternoon, after another fruitless attempt to talk some sense into her, I went back to Mrs. Drake. If anyone knew the truth, it was her. She had lived here longer than anyone else, had been here when the town's secrets still lingered like smoke in the air. I found her sitting on her creaky porch, watching the house with that same unsettling gaze. She looked up when I approached, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You came back," she said, her voice low, like she was waiting for something. "I need to know what's going on," I said, my frustration leaking through. "What is happening to my wife? What is happening to this garden?" Mrs. Drake was silent for a long moment, her wrinkled hands folded in her lap. I could see the hesitation in her eyes. It was like she was deciding whether or not to speak the truth, or perhaps whether or not she wanted to be free of whatever weight she had carried for so long. "It's not the garden that's dangerous," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the land beneath it. This place was never just a cemetery. It was the site of an old cult. One that believed the garden had power to raise the dead. But they needed bodies. They needed life. The plants were their offering to the earth, to feed the soil. But it wasn't enough." She looked at me, her eyes hollow with old sorrow. "The garden isn't just alive. It feeds off the dead. It grows from the remains of those the cult sacrificed. The plants, they thrive on blood, on decay. And when they're hungry, they take what they need, what they want." I stood there, stunned, the gravity of her words hitting me like a freight train. The missing persons, the skull in the garden, the flowers that had been growing from it. It all made sense now, but it made me sick to my stomach. This wasn't just some overgrown patch of land. It was a feeding ground, a place of death and rebirth. And Claire had become part of it. "Your wife," Mrs. Drake continued, her voice tinged with sadness. "She's already too deep into it. She's the one the garden wants next. And if you don't stop her, if you don't stop the garden, it will take everything from you." I felt a cold chill run down my spine as the implications of her words settled in. This wasn't just about a haunted garden. This wasn't just about superstition or strange occurrences. This was real, and it had been waiting for us. "But what do I do?" I asked, the desperation creeping into my voice. "How do I stop it?" Mrs. Drake's eyes hardened. "There's only one way. You must destroy it. Burn it to the ground. But be warned, the garden won't go down without a fight. The plants won't let go easily, and if you're not careful, you might just become part of it." The fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks suddenly felt overwhelming. But I knew there was no choice. The garden had already claimed too much, and if I didn't act now, it would take Claire, and then it would come for me. I went back home, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the yard. I found Claire again, standing in the garden, her hands gently caressing the vines as if they were alive, as if they were comforting her. Her face was blank empty, as though the garden had already claimed her soul. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were distant, focused on something only she could see. "Claire," I said, my voice breaking, Please, you have to come inside. We have to leave." But she didn't move. She just stood there, rooted to the spot. And that's when I saw it. The vines, the roots. They were moving, creeping toward her, almost like they were alive. I could see the way they were stretching, reaching for her legs, trying to pull her down into the earth. "Claire," I shouted, rushing toward her, but it was too late. The garden had already begun to claim her. Mrs. Drake's warning echoed in my mind as I realized the horrifying truth. The garden wasn't just alive, it was hungry, and it had been waiting for us to walk right into its grasp. I grabbed Claire, my hand shaking as I pulled her away from the vines that were curling around her legs, pulling her toward the earth beneath. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't seem to see me. Her gaze was fixed on something deeper, something far beyond me. She was lost in the garden, and no matter how hard I tried, it felt like the garden itself had her, like it had already claimed her spirit. "Claire, please," I begged, but she didn't respond. The vines tightened, and I could feel the weight of them, like they were made of something far stronger than just plant life. It was as if they were made of bone, muscle, and sinew, all working together to pull her under. I pulled harder, my heart racing. But the harder I tried to pull her away, the more it felt like the garden was fighting back. The ground beneath my feet trembled, the air grew thick and heavy with the scent of decaying flowers, and the vines seemed to grow faster, thicker, wrapping around everything in their path. Then I saw her. Mrs. Drake, standing by the edge of the garden, holding a sickle in her hand, her face twisted in something between sorrow and triumph. Her eyes met mine, and there was no mistaking the cruel satisfaction in them. "You should have listened," she said, her voice harsh and sharp. "The garden doesn't belong to you. It never did. You were always just passing through, but now you're part of it. All of you." The sickle in her hand glinted in the dimming light, and for a moment I was frozen. I knew what she meant. Claire was already lost, already part of the garden, and the only thing that could save her was the destruction of the very thing that had drawn her in. But could I do it? Could I destroy the thing that had become so much a part of her? Mrs. Drake's words echoed in my mind, but it didn't matter. I had no choice. I had to act before it was too late. I turned back to Claire, desperation clawing at my throat. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as the vines slowly pulled her down. "Claire, fight. You have to fight." But she was already slipping away, her fingers slipping through mine like sand. The garden was winning. It was pulling her under, and I was powerless to stop it. I could hear Mrs. Drake laughing. "You think you can save her? You think you can stop it? The garden needs her. It's too late for you both." I looked down at the sickle in her hand, at the way it gleamed in the dying light, and I knew what I had to do. It was the only way. I rushed forward, pushing through the vines that were now swarming around me, wrapping themselves around my arms and legs. But I couldn't stop. I had to save her. I had to. I grabbed the sickle from Mrs. Drake's hand, the cold steel biting into my skin as I wrenched it away from her. She didn't fight me. She just stood there, her eyes filled with something close to pity. But I didn't have time for pity. I turned and swung the sickle, cutting through the thick vines that were trying to drag Claire into the earth. The plants hissed, recoiling from the blade as if it burned them. I kept swinging, desperation fueling my movements as I hacked at the vines that were choking the life out of her. Claire's eyes snapped back to me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she seemed to see me. "Ben," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Help me." I pulled her free, my arms trembling as I dragged her away from the garden. The vines hissed in anger, snapping and twisting as they tried to reclaim her, but I didn't stop. I kept pulling her, her body heavy in my arms, until we reached the edge of the yard, away from the garden's grasp. Mrs. Drake's laughter stopped. She stood there, watching us, her face empty of emotion. "You've done it now," she said softly, almost regretfully. "The garden won't let you go. You're marked." I didn't care. I didn't care what she said. All that mattered was getting Claire out of that hellhole. I pulled her inside the house, slamming the door behind me, locking it as the sound of the garden's fury grew louder outside. But we were safe. At least, for now. We sat together on the floor, Claire leaning against me, her body trembling as the adrenaline finally wore off. I could hear her ragged breathing, but she was still here. She was still with me. But I knew it wasn't over. Mrs. Drake was right. The garden had marked us. It had claimed us in ways we couldn't yet understand. And no matter how far we ran, it would always be there, waiting for us to return. Because in the end, the garden always gets what it wants. And it wasn't finished with us yet. The night was eerily quiet, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see the garden's vines creeping up the walls, ready to pull us back into its grasp. But nothing moved. The silence was suffocating, as though the world outside had stopped. Claire's breathing had steadied, but I could feel the tension in her body, the way her shoulders were tight, as if she were bracing for something she couldn't name. She hadn't spoken much since we came inside. Her gaze was distant, like she was somewhere far away, still lost in the garden. I sat beside her, trying to keep my own fears in check, but it was hard to ignore the fact that we were trapped. The house felt too small, the walls too close, like they were closing in on us. We couldn't stay here forever, not with the garden still out there, still calling to Claire. "We can't stay," I said, my voice low, barely above a whisper. "We have to leave. We need to get out of here." Claire didn't respond. Her fingers trembled slightly as she twisted a strand of her hair between them, her eyes still far off, lost in a world I couldn't reach. "It's not over," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "It's never going to be over." I looked at her, my heart sinking. I knew she was right. The garden had already claimed so much of her, and no matter how far we ran, no matter where we went, it would follow. I had seen the way the vines reacted to the sickle, the way they hissed and recoiled. It wasn't just a garden, it was something else. Something ancient. And it wasn't going to let us go. "We have to burn it down," I said, more to myself than to her. "We have to destroy it, or it'll keep coming back. It won't stop." Claire's eyes flickered toward me, finally locking onto mine. For the first time in what felt like days, she seemed to focus on me, really see me. "You're right," she said, her voice trembling. "But how do we do that? How do we destroy something like that?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how we could destroy a force like the garden. All I knew was that it was dangerous, that it had already claimed lives. More than just the people who had disappeared over the years. It had claimed Claire's soul, and it wasn't finished yet. I had to act, and I had to act fast. "We'll find a way," I said, trying to reassure her. "We'll figure it out." But deep down, I knew there wasn't much time. The garden was hungry, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. I could feel it in my bones, the way the earth seemed to pulse with a strange, ominous energy. It was waiting, and if I didn't do something soon, it would claim us both. I stood up, my hands shaking as I grabbed the old oil lamp from the table. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but it was the only thing I had. Maybe fire was the answer. Maybe it would be enough to burn the garden to the ground, to take away its power once and for all. But as I stepped toward the door, I hesitated. There was a noise outside, a rustling like something was moving through the garden. It was faint at first, just a whisper on the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct. The sound of leaves and vines shifting, creaking under pressure. The garden was moving. It was awake. I rushed to the door, opening it just a crack, and peered out into the yard. The garden was alive, twisting and shifting as if it were breathing, its vines writhing like snakes. I could see the faint outline of someone, standing in the midst of it. Mrs. Drake. She was there, watching, waiting. And then I saw it. A figure behind her, rising from the earth, emerging from the roots. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its skin was a patchwork of dirt and decay, like it had been pulled from the soil itself. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Mrs. Drake turned, her eyes locking onto mine through the door, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "You can't stop it," she said, her voice low and raspy. "The garden belongs to the earth, and once it has claimed you, it never lets go." I felt a surge of panic. The garden was growing, spreading faster than I could imagine. It was alive, and it was hungry, and it had me, and Claire, right where it wanted us. I turned, my heart pounding, and grabbed the oil lamp from the table. "We have to burn it," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to burn it now, before it's too late." I rushed outside, the lamp in my hand, and moved toward the garden. Claire was behind me, her footsteps hesitant, but I knew she was with me. She had to be. We stood at the edge of the garden, the firelight casting long shadows on the ground, and I raised the lamp high, ready to throw it onto the roots. The garden seemed to sense what I was about to do. The vines shuddered, their movements frantic, as if they knew their end was near. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and let the lamp fall. It shattered against the ground, and the fire erupted, spreading quickly across the garden. The vines screamed in fury, their shrill cries cutting through the air like a dying animal. The flames leapt higher, consuming the plants, burning everything in its path. Mrs. Drake screamed too, her voice echoing through the night, but she didn't run. She didn't try to escape. Instead, she stepped forward into the flames, her arms raised to the sky as she screamed praises to the garden. I watched as the fire consumed everything. The garden, Mrs. Drake, the earth itself. The vines writhed and thrashed, but the fire wouldn't be stopped. It spread like a wildfire, and the garden burned, shrieking in agony as it was finally destroyed. When the flames finally died down, the only thing left was the scorched earth beneath our feet, and the skeletal remains that had once been tangled in the roots. The garden was gone. We were free. But as we stood there, staring at the ruins of the place that had once claimed everything we loved, I knew one thing for sure. It would never truly be gone. The garden had marked us, and as long as we lived, it would always be watching. We left that night, our belongings packed into the car, and we didn't look back. The town, the house, the garden, it was all behind us now. Let me start out by saying that I am not a people person. When the pandemic hit North America, it was probably the best thing to happen to me. Most of my time is spent online anyway, seeing as I work in data collection for an auditing company. Let me tell you, that wasn't much fun either, given how crazy 2020 has been. Anyway, none of that has to do with the problem I've been having. But I figured that most people start these types of rants off with a few anecdotal notes, so there you go. In a nutshell, I like to be left alone. This is why when I walked out in early September and saw that my neighbors were already beginning to decorate their house with spooky stuff, like inflatable Frankensteins and ghosts, I was a bit put off. Now I will admit they do this almost every year. They have 4 boys, all in elementary, and of course they want the holidays to be a big time, so why should 2020 be any different? It's just that their house sits adjacent to mine, so when I walk out it's the first thing I see every single day. And now, thanks to these over-the-top decorations, I was going to be seeing even more of it. Gradually, each day they added to the house. A few hanging plastic bats here, some spider webs there. I was doing my best to ignore it, really. And I know exactly how I'm going to sound here, being the Grinch of Halloween to some, so naturally I kept it to myself. But that ended a few nights back when I started to hear the wails. They installed large stereo speakers near the attic. I think because the screams coming from the attic were intense. It sounded like they had literally managed to get a soundbite from a crime scene. Let me tell ya, hearing that kind of noise at 3:30 in the morning is a bit alarming. I instinctively dialed 911 and complained. I wasn't going to up all night simply because they wanted to turn their place into a haunted house. Unfortunately for me, the police said that if it wasn't a serious problem where other neighbors complained that it wasn't a violation of any noise ordinances in the area. You can't be serious. Just listen to this. How am I supposed to get any sleep? I shouted, holding the phone so they could hear. Maybe that was a bit much, but I was pissed and had every right to be, I think. The operator reminded me that the line was meant for emergencies only and bid me a good night, leaving me frustrated and sleep deprived. I went down to my kitchen, got a bottle of Jack, and drank enough to knock myself out on the couch, trying to time the obnoxious screams. The next day I had cooled down a little and went over to talk to my neighbor after breakfast. Crossing their front lawn was like going through a minefield, though thanks to the pop-up ghosts and graves they had placed in their yard. The first few nearly gave me a heart attack as I moved to the door, rapping my knuckles on it to get their attention. No one came. I tried again, but got no response, so I walked around to the garage and tried there. It was open, and I couldn't help but to notice that their car was gone, and there was a large pool of fake blood on the concrete floor. I stepped forward and noted that they had a few other decorations lying around, like severed heads and zombie body parts, which I assumed would be placed in the yard. The whole thing smelled of high heaven. I held my nose and went to the door near their laundry room, trying again to get someone's attention, but again no one came. I sighed deeply and walked across the fake blood and paused to see where the bizarre smell was coming from. There were trash bags laying near the garage door, soaking wet from the recent storm, and I rolled my eyes, realizing it had to be that. Despite the fact that I wasn't feeling very neighborly, I went ahead and took the trash to the street and then went back to my house, wondering if any of my other neighbors would care enough to lodge a complaint. Other than this Halloween nut, the other folks around here are pretty ordinary, but none of them live close enough to really hear the noise. I decided instead that night to try and record it, so that way I could let the authorities listen and prove I was dealing with a nuisance on my block. Back home, I took a shower and got some equipment from downstairs ready to listen, but surprisingly, there was no screams that night, just silence. I stayed up to the wee hours. I sound so old saying that, but it's true. I was thinking maybe they realized I had called and complained about them, so that was why they were quiet. So I called it a night and decided to try again the next day. It was more of the same. Not a peep. In fact, I was starting to notice that not one of my neighbors was coming out of their house. This guy has 4 kids. It's hard to not notice them in the early morning as they scramble to catch the school bus. Especially because the driver of the bus is so courteous, he blasts his horn to get mom's attention for the littlest one to grab a face mask. But now there was nothing happening. It was that way for nearly a week, and I started to grow worried. At first I told myself it was because I hadn't gotten much sleep, but then I started doubting myself. What if the scream I heard hadn't been some kind of faux imitation? It rolled around in my mind like a pair of old dice, trying to figure out what I had heard. What if the wife had been attacked? What if it was a break-in? Then I thought back to the fake blood, and my body got stiff thinking of how I had stepped through it. Had I mistakenly walked into a real crime scene? The arms, the severed heads. My paranoia was screaming to me, my God, how could I have been so blind? I grabbed my robe and rushed out in the dead of night to go see, using my smartphone to guide the way across the murky suburb streets. Their house was so quiet now, not even a light on. I started to doubt myself again. Had it always been this quiet? I saw the plastic bats and the pop-up graves, and they seemed like they had been there a lot longer than I remembered. Checking the garage got me nowhere. Now, instead of seeing blood, it was spotless, as though someone had come in and cleaned the entire crime scene. It made me internally shiver as a dramatic scene played out in my mind. Chris, that was the husband's name. Chris was working in the kitchen, trying to get dinner ready because his wife Janice wasn't feeling good. It was a plot he had been brewing up for months, I told myself. He was gradually lacing her food to weaken her, and tonight he planned to finish the job. The scream I heard must have been when she realized something was off. Maybe Chris had decided he couldn't wait for her to just die. He wanted it swift. Had I seen him with a pretty young woman around town? Maybe. Yes, I think I had. In that coffee shop near the town square, was he having an affair? If I was his age and knew his wife couldn't perform in the bedroom, I wouldn't have blamed him. But murder wasn't the answer. All these thoughts scrambled through my brain as I stood there in the garage, taking in what had happened. I needed to get inside and check on the wife. What if he had left evidence? I ran back to my house, my heart racing now as I grabbed a few tools from my own shed. Some of them were missing, but I found what I needed. A crowbar could open my way into their house. I smashed it open in 2 tries and stepped into a dusty, dreary laundry room. Trying to turn on the lights had gotten nowhere. Instead, it was obvious that the family wasn't paying their bills. The house was cold like a tomb. My footsteps echoed down the empty corridor as I called out to anyone inside. But it looked like the place was abandoned. I took a step forward when abruptly a fake axe smashed its way out of the wall, and I jumped back. It was just another Halloween prop, but it looked so real, so lifelike. Chris must have just finished placing up more Halloween decorations when he decided to go upstairs and take care of his wife. The boys were in the den playing video games when they heard the screams. I imagined them running up to check on their mom, and then Dad panicked. He must have thought that the games would be loud enough that they wouldn't hear. Or he had hoped that Janice wouldn't put up a fight at all. He had miscalculated, and before he knew it, now he had a massacre on his hands. I walked up the steps, thinking of how he likely had hunted his own children in this house. They must have been so frightened. I could see different places in the wall where they had stopped to catch their breath or skirts in the rug where they had tried to hide. But their father was consumed with killing now. He was on a mission. Their begging and pleading wouldn't stop him. The little one probably went first, I thought as I got to the top of the stairs. The severed heads I had seen in the garage haunted me again as I thought of how he had murdered them. It was beyond repulsive. Upstairs I saw what looked like a hanging corpse. It was upside down from the rafters with its head loose as well, and it looked like it was meant to deter visitors from entering the master's suite. I ignored the prop and pushed through, desperate to see if I was right about what had transpired. But the room looked empty as well. Other than more Halloween decorations, it was another immaculate example of how Chris had gone so far to cover his tracks. What had he done with the rest of their body parts, though? I thought about the trash I had taken out and felt sick. He must have cut up all their bodies and planned to toss them out. I stood there in a daze, realizing how far he had been willing to go. The poor children turned into shredded cheese just because of his lust for another woman. I couldn't help but to vomit and shudder as I ran to the bathroom. As I heaved and caught my breath over the toilet, I checked in there for more clues. He had to have used chemicals on Janice's body in the tub, I thought as I smelled the weird bleach. Dissolving her with acids would have been easy, but how had he gotten access to anything like that? Then I thought about my own shed. Had he broken in and taken my own tools? Was he trying to frame me for this? I'm not sure why my brain jumped to that, but it instantly made me paranoid and I swallowed hard. What did I do? I had already contacted the police. Should I file another report? But they hadn't listened the first time, so now it made me feel like I was going to be a troublemaker. What if I was wrong about all of this? I needed more proof, I decided. I moved back to the hallway where the corpse was dangling and got a better look at it. My stomach dropped as it occurred to me this was no prop. It was Chris. I scrambled to find a way to cut him down, hoping to God he was still alive. It seemed unlikely. There was no way that anyone could be after a few minutes, let alone days. But still I did my best to cut him down and tried to resuscitate him. His skin was blue and his body was rigid. I felt sick realizing that he had killed himself after finishing his family. It was the only answer that made sense. Some part of me felt it was deserved, though, if my guess of how events played out was true. There was no way anyone with a conscience could live with themselves after killing their children, I thought. I took my smartphone out and got a few pictures, the proof I would need to show the cops. Then I made my way out of there. It felt like the house was haunted now that I knew the reality of what had happened, and I didn't want to spend another hour in there. Not even 1 minute. Back home, I tiredly put the final pieces of the puzzle together in my brain. The only part that didn't make sense was Chris' lover. Surely she would have come looking for them. Where was she? I got some shut-eye and tried to not be mortified by the thought that maybe Chris had gone after her too. The next day I was rudely woken up by the sound of police at my door. I didn't remember calling them, but I let them in anyway. What they told me had me feeling sick. They were there with a warrant to search my premises. One of my neighbors had reported suspicious activity in the area and sounds of screaming. I nearly lost it, angered that they were taking these reports seriously instead of my own. But inwardly my stomach was twisting and turning. What if Chris had somehow planted evidence against me before he committed an unaliving act? The officers combed the house and brought K9 units to sniff every nook and cranny. It didn't take long for them to find the trash bags, the ones I was sure that I had taken to the road, filled with body parts. The shed was next. They found trace evidence that my fingerprints were all over tools that were used to kill the family. I started to vomit, trying to find words that made sense. Of course my fingerprints would be there. They were my tools, for God's sake. I hardly knew what else to show them, so I insisted to the two officers they needed to check out Chris' house. That was where the true crime had been committed after all. They questioned me for what felt like hours. I literally was sure I was going to the slammer for this perceived crime. It felt like my life was over. I was frightened, shaking like a leaf as I told them what I believed happened. This is just a misunderstanding. I pay my taxes. I donate to the city. These people are the ones that are sick, I stammered. I told them how this had started with the family obsession for Halloween. My mind started to play tricks on me again as I replayed events. What if it had all been one massive stunt? What if none of it were real? I was losing my mind. My world was spinning. Were these even real cops? If so, they were going to toss me in a cell and throw away the key. But if not, I panicked as they kept writing their report and told them I needed to use the restroom. I went to vomit and to think. There wasn't going to be a way out of this if this was for real. All the evidence pointed toward me. My palms were sweaty and I started to convulse. There had to be a way out. I slammed my fist against the glass, causing shards to break in my hand. My fist was bloody now, but my hand was no longer shaking. In that moment, a new version of events played out in my head, one where I was the culprit. I'm not a people person. I hate my neighbors. Their decorations keep me up at all hours of the night, Halloween and Christmas. This year I had hoped that the pandemic would stop them, but it seemed to spur them on even further. Had I gone over there to confront them, got into a heated argument, and killed them all? No, it couldn't be. I didn't remember doing that. My reflection showed a twisted and dark smile, and it sent shivers down my spine. What was happening to me? I slammed at the glass again, trying to make it break entirely. The police managed to break the bathroom door down and pulled me away. The rest of the evening was a bit of a blur. They gave me something to calm my nerves and started talking about the event, the reality of what had really happened over the past few days. My neighbors have been dead for a year now, they said, and another neighbor, down the street, had grown concerned for my well-being when it seemed that I had checked on them more frequently. As though I thought they were still alive. They had no evidence to hold me, because the trash bags that had body parts didn't seem to hold any fingerprints, so it could have easily been someone else that had dropped them there. They had been sitting in my shed, sliced up and cut for a year now. They said the crime was still ongoing investigation, and since they didn't have a warrant, they just had to bid me a good night, having finished with their wellness check. And I stared out toward the neighbor's house. It was abandoned, a crime scene from a year ago on Halloween when I had grown tired of their screams and antics. And as I stared at their decorations, I saw their ghosts standing in the front lawn, glaring at me, pointing at me for their deaths. I know now how this Halloween will play out, because even though I didn't anticipate this nightmare, now I've become a part of their celebration.
Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.